The scream tore through the night before Elena even opened her eyes. She rolled off her thin straw mattress and hit the cold stone floor of the servant quarters, her heart slamming against her ribs. Smoke. She could smell smoke. Not the gentle smoke of a kitchen fire, but something sharp and wrong, curling under the door and stinging her throat. "Fire in the West Wing!" a voice bellowed from the corridor. Feet pounded past her door, servants running in every direction, some screaming, some silent with fear. Elena grabbed her shawl and pulled the door open. Orange light flickered at the end of the hallway, and black smoke rolled across the ceiling like a living thing. She should have run the other way, toward the exit, toward safety. Instead, she ran toward the fire. She didn't know why. She never did. It was as if something inside her chest pulled her forward, some old instinct that lived in her bones long before she understood it. Later, she would tell herself it was because she heard a child crying. In that moment, she simply moved. The West Wing storage room was where the young kitchen boy, Oliver, slept when his mother worked the late shift. Elena had seen him earlier that evening, no older than 7, carrying a basket of bread twice his size. Now his cries echoed through the smoke, thin and desperate. She pressed her sleeve against her mouth and pushed through the doorway. The heat hit her like a wall. Flames climbed the wooden shelves, eating through sacks of grain and barrels of oil. Oliver was curled in the corner, coughing, too frightened to move. "Look at me," Elena said, crouching low where the air was clearer. "Look at me, Oliver. We are leaving together, right now." He reached for her, and she lifted him onto her hip, without thinking about how heavy he was, without thinking about the flames licking closer to the only path out. She turned, and for a moment, the doorway disappeared behind a curtain of fire. Elena did not scream. She did not freeze. Something old and quiet took over her body. Her eyes, for just an instant, seemed to catch the firelight and throw it back, glowing amber, instead of their usual brown. She stepped through the flame-narrowed doorway in one motion, shielding Oliver's small body with her own, and came out the other side with only a burn along her forearm to show for it. Outside, in the courtyard, chaos had already gathered a crowd. Guards shouted orders. Buckets of water passed hand to hand in a long chain that could never move fast enough. And standing above it all, on the stone steps of the great hall, stood the one person every wolf in the pack feared and respected in equal measure. Alpha King Damien Blackthorne. He wore no armor, only a dark tunic thrown on in haste, but his presence alone made the courtyard feel smaller. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with black hair pushed back from a face that rarely showed anything close to warmth. His eyes swept over the scene with the cold calculation of a commander assessing a battlefield, not a young king worried for his people. Elena set Oliver down gently, and the boy's mother rushed forward sobbing, pulling her son into her arms. Elena stood, coughing, her shawl scorched, her arm throbbing, where the burn had already begun to blister. She looked up, and for one brief moment, her eyes met the Alpha King's. He looked at her, truly looked, the way he never had before in the 2 years she had served in his household. His gaze lingered on the burn on her arm, on the streak of soot across her cheek, on the strange steadiness in the way she held herself despite what she had just walked through. Then a guard called his name, reporting that the fire had started near the oil stores, and his attention snapped away, as if she had never existed at all. That was how it always was with Damien Blackthorne. He looked past her. He walked past her in the halls, past her in the dining hall, past her in the training yards where she was sometimes sent to deliver messages. To him, she was another face among hundreds of servants, another name he had never bothered to learn. She told herself she did not mind. She told herself this every single day, and most days she almost believed it. By the time the fire was put out, the sky had begun to turn a pale gray at the edges, promising a dawn nobody in the West Wing quarters felt ready for. Elena sat on an overturned crate near the well, letting the healer wrap a strip of clean cloth around her burn. The healer, an older woman named Margaret with kind eyes and rough hands, tisked under her breath. "You could have waited for the guards," Margaret said. "Running into a burning room, at your age, with your rank, what were you thinking, girl?" "I wasn't thinking," Elena admitted. "I just moved." Margaret studied her for a long moment, the way she sometimes did, as if trying to solve a puzzle she couldn't quite piece together. "You've always been strange, Elena Voss. Not bad strange. Just strange." Like you don't quite belong in the shape you're wearing. Elena laughed it off, though the words settled somewhere deep and uncomfortable inside her. It was not the first time someone had said something like that to her. Ever since she could remember, since the earliest days at the orphan house on the edge of the Blackthorn territory, people had looked at her a little too long, a little too curiously, as if searching for something they expected to find and never quite did. She had no parents that anyone could name, no family crest, no bloodline, no story of how she came to be left at the orphan house at the age of 4, half-starved and unable to speak for almost a full year afterward. The matron who ran the house used to say, Elena arrived like a stray cat, wandering out of the forest with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small burn scar on her shoulder that never fully healed, shaped almost like a flame. Nobody had ever asked where the scar came from. Elena had stopped asking herself a long time ago, because every time she tried to remember anything before the orphan house, all she found was smoke and heat and a sound like screaming that might have been her own. While Elena sat by the well with her arm being bandaged, Damien stood in the scorched remains of the storage room, arms crossed, his sharp eyes moving over the blackened shelves and collapsed beams. His second in command, a broad-shouldered warrior named Nathaniel, crouched near the far wall, running his fingers over a patch of stone that had cracked from the heat. This did not start on its own, Nathaniel said quietly, careful not to let his voice carry beyond the two of them. Oil stores do not simply catch fire in the middle of the night without a spark to start them. Damien said nothing for a long moment. He had learned, in the 3 years since his father's death, that silence often revealed more than questions did. He knelt beside the warrior and examined the same patch of stone, noting the strange pattern the flames had left behind, a pattern that curled outward from a single point, rather than spreading evenly the way an accidental fire should. Someone set this, Damien said finally, his voice low and hard. Find out who had access to the West Wing storage after the evening meal. Question the guards on duty. Quietly, Nathaniel. I do not want panic in the halls before I understand what we are dealing with. You think it was aimed at someone specific? Damien's jaw tightened. He thought of the boy who had nearly died in that room, the kitchen worker's son, who had done nothing to earn an enemy in his short life, and he thought, unwillingly, of the servant girl who had walked into the flames to save him, the one whose eyes had met his, for that brief, strange moment in the courtyard. I don't know yet, Damien admitted. But I intend to find out. He straightened and walked the perimeter of the ruined room once more, his mind working through possibilities the way it always did, methodical and unforgiving. Blackthorn Pack had enemies, as every pack did, rivals who resented the strength of his territory and the wealth of its lands. But an attack this small, this contained, felt different from the open aggression he expected from rival packs. It felt personal, deliberate, aimed. He thought again of the girl's eyes catching the firelight, glowing amber for the briefest instant, before returning to ordinary brown. He had seen many things in his years as Alpha, strength that surprised him, courage that surprised him, but something about the way she had moved through that fire, calm and certain where anyone else would have panicked, had stayed lodged in the back of his mind all morning like a splinter he could not quite remove. He told himself it was simply curiosity about the arson, nothing more. A king did not have time to wonder about the eyes of a servant girl he had walked past 1,000 times without noticing. And yet, later that morning, when his duties took him through the East Hall, where the tables were being prepared for the elders' gathering, his gaze found her without his permission, moving across the room, to where she stood polishing wood, with careful, steady strokes, her bandaged arm held slightly away from her body. She did not notice him watching. She was too focused on her work, humming something soft and tuneless under her breath, a small habit that made her seem younger than her years, softer than the composed woman who had walked out of a burning room without a scream. Damien stopped in the doorway longer than he meant to. One of the elders, a stern old wolf named Edmund, cleared his throat beside him, drawing his attention back to the matters of the day, the endless list of decisions that came with wearing a crown he had never wanted quite this young. The elders wished to discuss the mate ceremony again, Your Majesty, Edmund said. They grow impatient. A pack without a queen invites question about the strength of your line. I am aware, Damien said, his voice returning to its usual flat, controlled tone. Tell them I will address it before the next full moon. Not before. Edmund bowed and departed, and Damien allowed himself one final glance toward the East Hall before turning away. Elena had not looked up once. She never did. It should not have bothered him, and yet something about her complete indifference to his presence needled at him in a way he could not quite name, an irritation that felt suspiciously close to something else entirely. He pushed the thought away and returned to the business of ruling, to reports of border skirmishes and grain shortages, and the slow, grinding weight of responsibility that had settled onto his shoulders the day his father died and never once lifted since. By the time the sun rose fully over the packlands the following morning, servants were already back at work, as though nothing had happened. That was the way of Blackthorn Castle. Fires were put out, questions were asked quietly behind closed doors, and life resumed with the same cold efficiency the Alpha King brought to everything he touched. Elena's duties that day placed her in the East Hall, polishing the long banquet table in preparation for a gathering of pack elders. Her arm ached beneath the bandage, but she worked in silence, listening to the older maids gossip as they always did. They say the Alpha King's mother has called for the mate ceremony to happen before the next full moon, one maid whispered, glancing around as if the walls themselves might report her for speaking too freely. The elders have been pressing him for a year now. A king without a queen is a pack without an heir, and a pack without an heir is a pack waiting for war. Lady Seraphine will be chosen, surely, another maid answered. Her family has the strongest bloodline outside the royal line itself, and she has made her interest known to anyone who will listen. Elena kept polishing, though something about the conversation made her chest tighten in a way she did not want to examine too closely. It was foolish to feel anything at all about who the Alpha King chose to marry. She was a servant. He did not know her name. Their lives ran on parallel tracks that would never cross, no matter how many burning rooms she walked out of. And yet, later that afternoon, she was sent to deliver a stack of ceremonial linens to the private study of Queen Isolde, the Alpha King's mother. Elena had only spoken to the Queen a handful of times in her years of service. Brief exchanges about laundry schedules or seating arrangements, nothing more. Isolde was a striking woman even in her middle years, with silver threading through dark hair and eyes the color of storm clouds, sharp and watchful, in a way that made most servants nervous. Elena knocked, was granted entry, and stepped into a study lined with old books and tapestries, depicting battles from generations past. She set the linens on the designated table and turned to leave, offering the customary bow. "Wait." Elena froze at the doorway. Queen Isolde had risen from her desk and was walking toward her, slow and deliberate, her gaze fixed on Elena's face with an intensity that made the younger woman's skin prickle. "Your Majesty?" "Your arm," Isolde said, nodding toward the bandage. "I heard about the fire. You went in after the boy." "Anyone would have done the same," Elena said quickly, though she suspected that was not entirely true. Isolde did not answer right away. Instead, she reached out, and for one strange, suspended moment, she gently turned Elena's wrist to examine the edge of the bandage, where a small portion of skin was visible beneath. Not the burn itself, but the old scar just above it, the flame-shaped mark on her shoulder that had shifted into view when her collar slipped. Something changed in Queen Isolde's expression. It was there and gone so fast that Elena almost convinced herself she had imagined it, but for one heartbeat, the Queen's composed face cracked into something raw. Shock, recognition, perhaps even fear. "Where did you get that mark?" Isolde asked, her voice suddenly quiet, stripped of its usual regal calm. "I don't know, Your Majesty. I've had it as long as I can remember, since before the orphan house." "The orphan house?" Isolde repeated softly, almost to herself. "And before that?" "I don't remember anything before that." "I'm sorry." Queen Isolde was silent for a long moment, studying Elena's face now instead of her shoulder, searching it feature by feature, the way someone searches for a familiar shape in the clouds. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the strange intensity vanished behind a practiced, polite smile. "Forgive me," Isolde said, stepping back. "You reminded me of someone, that's all. You may go." Elena bowed again and left the study as fast as dignity allowed, her pulse racing for reasons she could not name. She told herself it meant nothing. Queens were allowed strange moments. Perhaps Isolde had lost someone once, a sister or a friend, and the scar had simply stirred an old memory. But that night, lying awake on her thin mattress, with her bandaged arm throbbing gently in time with her heartbeat, Elena could not stop replaying the look on the Queen's face. It was not the look of someone remembering a friend. It was the look of someone who had just seen a ghost. Before sleep found her, Elena's thoughts drifted to the one friend she had made in her 2 years at Blackthorn Castle, a laundry maid named Charlotte, who slept in the cot beside hers. Charlotte was a few years older, quick with a laugh, and completely unbothered by rank or royalty, in a way that always made Elena feel a little braver just standing near her. "You are shaking," Charlotte whispered from the darkness, sitting up when she heard Elena shift restlessly on her mattress. "Was it the fire? Or was it the Queen?" "Both, I think," Elena admitted. "She looked at my scar like it meant something, like she recognized it." Charlotte was quiet for a moment, considering this with more seriousness than her usual teasing tone allowed. "My grandmother used to say the Queen lost people in the old wars, before the Alpha King was even born. Maybe your scar reminded her of someone from that time." "Maybe," Elena said, though the explanation did not settle the uneasy feeling in her chest. "Or maybe," Charlotte said, a small grin creeping into her voice, despite the late hour, "the King finally noticed you exist, and you are far too distracted thinking about the mother to notice what that might mean about the son. He looked at my arm, because it was burned, Charlotte. That is not the same as noticing me." "He looked at your eyes first," Charlotte said. "I saw it from across the courtyard. Everyone did." Elena rolled onto her side, pulling her thin blanket higher, despite the warmth of the summer night, and refused to answer. It was easier to dismiss the idea outright than to let herself wonder about it, because wondering led nowhere good for a servant girl with no name and no family, and a king who was expected to marry a woman of noble blood before the next full moon. "Go to sleep," she told Charlotte, though the words were really meant for herself. Charlotte laughed softly and settled back down, and within minutes, her breathing had evened into the steady rhythm of sleep. Elena lay awake a while longer, staring up at the shadows on the ceiling, replaying the moment in the courtyard against her will, the way Damien's dark eyes had held hers for just a heartbeat longer than necessary before duty pulled him away. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself this several times, the way she told herself many things she did not quite believe, until exhaustion finally pulled her under. Sleep did not come easily. When it finally did, it brought with it the dream that had haunted her for as long as she could remember, the one she never told anyone about, because there were no words that made it sound like anything other than madness. In the dream, she was small, smaller than Oliver had been that night in the storage room. She was running through a village she did not recognize, past houses swallowed in flame, past the shapes of people she could not see clearly no matter how hard she tried. A woman's voice called out to her, desperate and full of love, calling her a name that was not Elena. "Little flame," the voice cried. "Run. Do not look back. Run, and do not stop until you are far, far away." She always woke at the same moment, right as a wall of fire rose up to swallow the voice whole, right as unbearable heat pressed against her back, like a hand pushing her forward into the dark. Elena sat up in the darkness of the servant quarters, breathing hard, her nightclothes damp with sweat despite the cold stone room around her. She pressed her palm against the scar on her shoulder, the one shaped like a flame, the one Queen Isolde had looked at as though it were the answer to a question she had been asking her entire life. Somewhere above her, in the private wing of the castle where kings and queens slept behind heavy oak doors, Queen Isolde was not sleeping either. She stood at her window, looking out over the dark shape of the packlands, her hands folded so tightly together that her knuckles had gone pale. 20 years. It had been almost 20 years since the fire that destroyed the Emberfall pack, since the massacre that history books in Blackthorn territory recorded only as a tragic accident, a story everyone had long since stopped questioning. Isolde had questioned it every single day since. She had carried the weight of what really happened that night, like a stone lodged permanently beneath her ribs, and she had never told a single soul the truth, not even her own son. She had heard, once, long ago, a rumor that a small child had somehow escaped the flames. She had chased that rumor for years, before finally letting it die, along with her hope, believing it had simply been the desperate wishing of people who could not accept how thorough the destruction had truly been. Now a servant girl with a flame-shaped scar had just walked out of a burning room, without a single serious injury. carrying a child to safety, as though fire itself refused to touch her. Isolde closed her eyes and allowed herself, for the first time in 20 years, to hope again. But hope, she knew better than anyone, was a dangerous thing to carry inside these castle walls. If she was right about who Elena truly was, then the girl was not only the answer to a mystery that had haunted Isolde for 2 decades. She was also, without knowing it, the target of enemies who believed the entire Emberfall bloodline had already been erased from the world, and who would do anything necessary to make certain it stayed that way. Downstairs, in the servant quarters, Elena finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, unaware that the quiet, ordinary life she had built for herself, a life of polishing tables and folding linens, and being invisible to a king who never once looked at her twice, was about to end forever. Tomorrow, everything would begin to change. She simply did not know it yet. The great hall smelled of roasted meat and fresh flowers the following evening, prepared for a formal dinner honoring the visiting elders from the northern territories. Elena moved along the long table with a pitcher of water, filling cups with practiced precision. Her eyes lowered, as she had been trained to keep them. Servants were meant to be seen only when needed, and otherwise forgotten, a rule she had followed so completely for 2 years that most nobles in the hall genuinely did not know her name. At the head of the table, Damien sat with the weight of 100 watching eyes on him, his expression carved from stone as the elders discussed trade routes and border patrols in voices too formal to hide their true purpose. Every conversation eventually circled back to the same subject, the one Elena had heard whispered among the maids for weeks now. A king must have a queen, Elder Edmund said, setting down his goblet with deliberate emphasis. The northern packs already question whether Blackthorn's strength has weakened since your father's passing. An empty throne beside you only feeds that doubt. My throne is not empty, Damien replied evenly. I sit on it every day. You know what I mean, Your Majesty. Damien's jaw tightened. The only visible sign of the irritation Elena suspected simmered beneath his controlled exterior. She had refilled his cup twice already that evening, and both times he had thanked her with a brief nod, nothing more, nothing that separated her from any other servant in the room. It should not have disappointed her. She reminded herself of this as she moved down the table toward the far end, where Lady Seraphine sat in a gown the color of deep wine, her dark hair arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken hours to complete. Seraphine caught Elena's eye and held out her empty cup without looking at her directly, the way someone might gesture at a piece of furniture rather than a person. More wine, she said simply. Elena poured without comment, though she felt the weight of Seraphine's attention shift and sharpen the moment the pouring was done. You are the one who ran into the fire, Seraphine said, studying her now with open curiosity, the kind that made Elena's skin prickle uncomfortably. The whole castle is talking about it. Quite brave, for a servant. Anyone would have done the same, my lady. Would they? Seraphine's smile did not reach her eyes. I doubt many would risk their own skin for a kitchen boy who means nothing to them. Unless, of course, you had some other reason to want attention drawn to yourself that night. The implication hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Elena kept her expression carefully neutral, the way she had learned to do during years of being talked down to by nobles who assumed servants had no feelings worth considering. I only wanted to help him, my lady, nothing more. Seraphine studied her a moment longer, then waved a dismissive hand, already losing interest, or pretending to. Of course. Go on then. You are holding up the line. Elena moved down the table, her chest tight with an anger she was not permitted to show. She had almost reached the far end, when a strange, prickling sensation crawled up the back of her neck, entirely separate from her irritation at Seraphine's cruelty. It was a feeling she had experienced only a handful of times in her life, always right before something went wrong, a sense of wrongness in the air itself that she had never been able to explain to anyone, not even Charlotte. She glanced toward the tall windows lining the eastern wall of the hall, half expecting to see something there, though the dark grounds outside revealed nothing but shadow and moonlight. Still, the feeling did not fade. If anything, it grew stronger, a pressure building behind her ribs that felt uncomfortably close to fear. She set down her pitcher near the serving table and, without fully deciding to do it, found herself approaching Nathaniel, who stood near the hall's entrance keeping watch as he always did during formal gatherings. He was a warrior first and a courtier, only when duty demanded it, and something about his steady presence made him easier to approach than most of the nobility filling the room. "Something is wrong," she said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that only he would hear. "Near the eastern border. I don't know how I know, but I do." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, clearly unsure whether to take her seriously. "The Eastern Border Patrol reported nothing unusual this evening." "I'm not saying they lied. I'm saying something is coming. Please, just send word to double the watch tonight." Before Nathaniel could respond, a ripple of amused laughter drew their attention. Seraphine had noticed the exchange from her seat and leaned toward the noblewoman beside her, speaking just loud enough to be overheard. "It seems the servant girl fancies herself a strategist now, advising the king's own guard on matters of defense. How charming." Heat rushed to Elena's face as several heads turned in her direction, including, finally, Damien's. His dark eyes found her across the length of the hall, unreadable, assessing, and for one suspended moment she thought perhaps he would ask her to explain herself, would take the warning seriously the way Nathaniel seemed almost willing to. Instead, his expression shuttered closed, and he addressed the table at large, in a voice that carried easily over the murmuring crowd. "The border patrols are well trained and well equipped. I trust their reports over rumor and unfounded worry." His gaze flicked briefly to Elena, cool and dismissive. "Return to your duties." The words landed like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were so utterly indifferent, so completely certain that her instincts counted for nothing, in a room full of people who mattered more than she did. Elena bowed her head and retreated toward the kitchen, her cheeks burning with humiliation she refused to let show on her face. Behind her, the conversation resumed, as though nothing had happened, the elders returning to their discussions of trade and marriage, Seraphine's satisfied smile settling comfortably back into place. Only Nathaniel's gaze lingered on Elena a moment longer than the rest, a small crease forming between his brows, as though her warning had planted a seed of doubt he could not quite shake, despite his king's dismissal. In the kitchen, Elena set down her pitcher with more force than necessary, drawing a curious glance from Margaret, who was overseeing the preparation of the next course. "Rough evening?" Margaret asked. "The king thinks I'm a fool," Elena muttered, immediately regretting the disrespect in her tone, though Margaret only chuckled. "Kings think many things, girl. Doesn't make them right." She handed Elena a fresh tray of bread, studying her face with the same careful attention she always seemed to offer. "What has you so unsettled? And don't tell me it's wounded pride. I've known you 2 years. This is something else." Elena hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "I felt something, before I even spoke to Nathaniel. Like danger, coming from the east. I can't explain it better than that." Margaret's expression grew serious in a way Elena rarely saw from the older woman. "There are wolves in this world with senses sharper than most, girl. Instincts that run deeper than training can teach. If something in you is telling you danger is close, I would not be so quick to dismiss it, no matter what any king says." The words offered small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. Elena carried the tray back toward the hall, her mind still turning over the strange pressure building behind her ribs. The certainty that something terrible was moving closer with every passing hour, regardless of how thoroughly the Alpha King chose to ignore her warning. High above the great hall, in the private study where she often retreated in the evenings, Queen Isolde stood over a set of old maps spread across her desk, tracing the eastern border with one careful finger. She had received word only an hour earlier, from a contact she trusted outside the official chain of command, a scout loyal to her personally rather than to the crown, reporting unusual movement near the border that the official patrols had somehow missed entirely. It was too similar, she thought grimly, to the pattern that had preceded the Emberfall massacre 20 years earlier. Small movements first, easily dismissed, easily explained away, until the night everything erupted into fire, and screaming, and loss, that could never be undone. She thought of Elena's scar, the shape of a flame burned into skin that should not have survived what it clearly had. She thought of the strange composure the girl had shown walking out of a burning room, and the reports Isolde had quietly gathered over the past day regarding Elena's arrival at the orphan house all those years ago, arriving from the direction of the old Emberfall territory, with no memory of how she got there. If she was right, if Elena truly was who Isolde suspected her to be, then the danger gathering at the eastern border was not a coincidence at all. It was a hunt, resumed after 20 years of believing its prey had already been destroyed. Isolde pressed her palm flat against the old map and closed her eyes, weighing a decision she had avoided making for 2 decades. The truth she carried could protect Elena, or it could place her in even greater danger than she already faced without knowing it. There was no way to be certain which outcome her silence, or her honesty, would bring. Long after the dinner guests had retired, and the great hall had emptied of its noise and candlelight, Damien remained at the head of the long table, alone, except for the dying embers in the hearth. He should have gone to bed hours ago. Instead, he sat turning a silver cup slowly between his fingers, his mind replaying the moment he had dismissed Elena in front of the entire hall. It had been the correct decision. He told himself this firmly, the way he told himself most things when doubt tried to creep in where it did not belong. A king could not chase after every servant's feeling of unease, could not let rumor and instinct override the discipline of trained patrols who reported the border secure. If he entertained every whisper of danger, he would spend his reign chasing shadows instead of ruling a pack that depended on his steadiness. And yet something about the certainty in Elena's voice had stayed with him, lodged uncomfortably beside the memory of her walking through fire without hesitation the night before. She was not a woman prone to dramatics. In 2 years of quiet, competent service, he could not recall a single instance of her drawing attention to herself, seeking favor, or exaggerating for effect. If anything, she seemed to actively avoid notice, moving through the castle like someone determined never to be seen. So why, he wondered, had she risked public humiliation to deliver a warning she had to know would be dismissed? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Nathaniel entered without waiting for permission, a privilege earned through years of loyal service and near constant proximity to the throne. "You're still awake," Nathaniel observed, though it was hardly a question. "As are you," Damien replied. "What is it?" Nathaniel hesitated, an unusual pause for a man who typically spoke his mind without much delay. "I sent additional guards to the eastern border tonight." Quietly, without drawing attention to it. Damien set down his cup, studying his second-in-command with narrowed eyes. "I gave no such order." "No, you didn't. I gave it myself, on my own authority, and I'll accept whatever consequence you deem appropriate for acting without your permission." Nathaniel's expression remained steady despite the admission, but something about that girl's warning did not sit right with me. Call it instinct if you like. I've learned not to ignore instinct when it comes this strongly, whether it comes from myself or someone else. Damien was quiet for a long moment, weighing his second's judgment against his own earlier certainty. Nathaniel had served under his father before serving under him, had survived 3 border conflicts, and countless skirmishes through careful instinct that rarely proved wrong. It was not a small thing that he had acted on Elena's warning, despite the king's public dismissal of it. "You believe her," Damien said finally. It was not quite a question. "I believe something is happening that we don't fully understand yet," Nathaniel corrected carefully. "Whether that has anything to do with her instincts specifically, I couldn't say. But there was truth in her voice tonight, Your Majesty. The kind of truth that doesn't come from a servant trying to seem important." Damien said nothing, but he did not countermand the order either. Instead, he rose from the table and moved toward the window, overlooking the dark grounds beyond the castle walls, the same eastern direction Elena had gestured toward with such unsettling certainty. "Keep me informed," he said finally. "If anything changes at that border tonight, I want to know immediately, regardless of the hour." Nathaniel nodded and took his leave, and Damien remained at the window a while longer, watching the tree line at the edge of his vision, as though he might catch some hint of the danger Elena claimed to sense, some confirmation that would explain the strange unease settling over him despite his own dismissal of her warning. He thought again of her eyes catching the firelight, glowing amber for an instant before returning to ordinary brown. He thought of the scar Margaret had mentioned once in passing, a mark on her shoulder shaped, oddly, like a flame. He was not a man given to superstition, but something about the accumulation of small, strange details surrounding Elena Voss had begun to form a picture he could not quite bring into focus, no matter how he tried. Perhaps, he thought, it was simply exhaustion. The weight of ruling a pack alone, without a queen to share the burden, wore on him more than he liked to admit even to himself. Perhaps his mind was simply searching for something interesting to focus on, amid the endless grind of trade disputes and marriage pressure. and elders who never stopped reminding him of his duty. Or perhaps, some quieter voice in the back of his mind suggested, there was something genuinely different about the servant girl who had walked past him 1,000 times, without either of them truly seeing the other, until the night of fire changed everything neither of them yet understood. Down in the servant quarters, Elena lay awake long after Charlotte's breathing had evened into sleep, staring at the same shadowed ceiling as the night before, the same pressure still sitting heavy behind her ribs despite the passing hours. The feeling had not faded the way she hoped it might. If anything, as the night deepened, it seemed to sharpen, a low hum of warning that refused to let her rest. She did not know that, several floors above her, both the Alpha King and his most trusted warrior had begun to take her instincts more seriously than either would openly admit. She only knew that something was coming, closer, with every passing hour, and that no one in power had truly believed her enough to prepare for what she feared was still ahead. She closed her eyes and tried, without success, to convince herself that the wrongness she felt was nothing more than exhaustion and hurt pride from the humiliation of the evening. But deep in the part of herself she had never fully understood, the part that had carried her through fire without a scream, she knew better. Whatever was coming, it would not wait much longer to arrive. The horn blast that split the night air 2 hours before dawn was unmistakable, a long, urgent sound that every wolf in Blackthorn territory had been trained since childhood to recognize as a call to arms. Elena bolted upright before she was even fully awake, her heart hammering as Charlotte scrambled out of bed beside her, both of them reaching instinctively for their shoes in the darkness. "That's the border alarm," Charlotte said, her voice tight with fear. "That's not a drill." Outside, the castle had erupted into controlled chaos. Guards ran through the corridors calling orders. Servants were herded toward the inner keep, where thick stone walls offered the best protection. And somewhere in the distance, faint but growing louder, came the sound Elena had been dreading, without fully understanding why. Snarls, the clash of claws against armor, the unmistakable sounds of a pack under attack. "Rogue wolves," someone shouted from the corridor, breaching the eastern fence line. "All able fighters to the wall, now." Elena's body moved before her mind fully caught up with the decision, pushing past the tide of frightened servants heading toward the keep, running instead toward the sound of battle. Charlotte grabbed at her sleeve, panic in her eyes. "Elena, where are you going? The keep is that way." "I have to help," Elena said, and even as the words left her mouth, she did not fully understand why she felt such overwhelming certainty about it. She was a servant. She had no training, no weapon, no reason to believe she could do anything useful against wolves capable of tearing through trained guards. And yet the same instinct that had pulled her into a burning room 2 nights earlier now pulled her toward danger, with equal, undeniable force. She broke free of Charlotte's grip and ran. The scene at the eastern wall was worse than she imagined. A dozen rogue wolves, larger and more savage than any she had seen in training demonstrations, had breached the outer fence line and were locked in brutal combat with Blackthorn guards. Fire from overturned torches had caught in patches of dry grass, casting flickering orange light across a battlefield of snapping jaws and desperate shouts. Somewhere in the chaos, she could hear Nathaniel's voice bellowing commands, trying to organize a defensive line against an assault that seemed to be gaining ground with terrifying speed. Elena froze at the edge of the tree line, suddenly aware of how insane her decision to come here had been. She had no weapon. She had no training. She was, by any reasonable measure, about to die for no purpose other than an instinct she could not explain. Then she saw the guard. A young fighter, barely older than herself, had been separated from the main defensive line, cornered against a low stone wall by a rogue wolf twice his size. He had lost his sword somewhere in the chaos, and was scrambling backward with nothing but his bare hands to defend himself, terror written plainly across his face, as the rogue wolf advanced with slow, predatory patience. Elena did not think. She grabbed a fallen torch, still burning at one end, and ran directly into the path of the rogue wolf, without any clear plan beyond the desperate need to give the young guard a chance to escape. "Here!" she screamed, waving the torch. "Over here!" The wolf's head snapped toward her, drawn by the movement and the flame, and for one terrifying heartbeat, its yellow eyes locked onto hers with predatory focus. Elena's whole body went cold with fear, and yet beneath the fear, something else stirred. something ancient and steady that seemed to rise up from the very core of her being. The wolf lunged. What happened next would be talked about among the Blackthorn guards for weeks afterward, though none of them could fully agree on the details, each version growing slightly more impossible with every retelling. What Elena knew, in the moment itself, was that time seemed to slow, that her body moved with a speed and certainty she had never possessed before, sidestepping the wolf's lunge with an ease that felt less like learned skill and more like ancient memory, finally waking after years of dormant sleep. She swung the burning torch in a wide arc, catching the wolf across its flank, and the creature yelped and stumbled back, momentarily disoriented by the flame. In that brief opening, Elena did something even she could not fully explain afterward. She felt a surge of heat build in her chest, pressing outward through her arms, through her hands, until the torch in her grip flared brighter, hotter, the flame leaping higher, as though responding directly to whatever was happening inside her. The rogue wolf yelped again, this time in genuine pain, and turned to flee into the darkness beyond the fence line, abandoning its cornered prey entirely. Elena stood frozen, staring at her own trembling hands, at the torch that had somehow burned twice as bright as it should have, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The young guard she had saved scrambled to his feet, staring at her with wide, disbelieving eyes. What was that?" he stammered. "How did you do that?" "I don't know," Elena admitted, her voice shaking as badly as her hands. "I don't know." There was no time to examine it further. Another wolf broke from the tree line, and the guard, recovering his composure faster than Elena managed to recover hers, grabbed a fallen sword from the ground and positioned himself protectively in front of her. Together, in an unlikely and improvised partnership, they held their small section of the wall until reinforcements arrived, Elena wielding her torch with a confidence that felt both foreign and deeply, strangely familiar, as though her body remembered a fight her mind had never learned. By the time the last rogue wolf was driven back across the border, the eastern sky had begun to lighten with the first gray hints of dawn. The battlefield fell into an exhausted, ringing silence, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the low murmur of guards checking on one another, amid the wreckage of overturned fences and scorched grass. Damien arrived at the wall just as the fighting ended, having led a second defensive line from the northern gate the moment the alarm sounded. He moved through the aftermath with the focused efficiency of a commander assessing losses, checking on wounded guards, listening to hurried reports from his officers. It was Nathaniel who finally pulled him aside, his expression a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. "You need to see this," Nathaniel said, leading him toward the section of wall where Elena still stood, torch now extinguished and forgotten in her hand, being fussed over by the young guard she had saved, and two other soldiers who had witnessed at least part of what happened. "She held this section alone for several minutes," Nathaniel said quietly, keeping his voice low enough that only Damien would hear. "Before Corwin got his sword back, she was the only thing standing between him and a rogue twice his size. I saw her myself, from a distance. Her torch burned wrong, Damien. Brighter than any torch should burn, and the wolf fled from it like it was more than fire." Damien's gaze found Elena across the scorched clearing, taking in her disheveled hair, the soot smudged across her face for the second time in 3 days, the trembling in her hands that she was trying and failing to hide. She looked exhausted, frightened, and entirely unlike the composed, invisible servant who had polished his banquet table without ever once looking up to meet his eyes. He crossed the distance between them before he had fully decided to do so, aware of the guards watching, aware of how unusual it was for the Alpha King to approach a servant so directly in front of witnesses. Elena straightened when she saw him coming, some instinct for propriety asserting itself despite her obvious exhaustion. "Your Majesty," she said, offering a bow that came out slightly unsteady. "You warned me," Damien said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, stripped of the cold formality he usually wore like armor. "Last night at dinner, you warned me something was coming from the east, and I dismissed you in front of the entire hall." "You had no reason to believe me," Elena said. "I had no proof, just a feeling. A feeling that saved lives tonight," Damien said. "Including, apparently, one of my own guards." His gaze dropped to her hands, still faintly trembling, and then to the extinguished torch she still clutched, as though she had forgotten how to let go of it. "Nathaniel tells me, the flame you carried did not behave the way fire should behave." Elena's throat tightened. She had no explanation to offer him, no story that made sense of what her own body had done in the heat of that fight. The strange heat that had surged through her chest and into her hands, the way the flame had responded to something inside her that she could not name. "I don't know what happened," she admitted quietly. "I've never done anything like that before in my life. I don't understand it any better than you do." Damien studied her for a long moment, and for once, his expression was not unreadable. It was something closer to curiosity, mixed with a wariness he did not fully bother to hide, as though he had just discovered a piece to a puzzle he had not previously known existed, one that raised far more questions than it answered. "Go rest," he said finally, his voice returning to something closer to its usual measured control, though softer than before. "You've done enough for one night. We will speak more of this later." Elena bowed again, and allowed herself, finally, to be led away by Charlotte, who had arrived amid the chaos, and now hovered anxiously at her side, checking her for injuries, with the same fierce concern she always showed. As they walked back toward the castle, Elena glanced over her shoulder once, finding Damien still watching her retreat, his expression unreadable once more, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested the wall he usually kept so carefully in place had shifted, however slightly, sometime during that long and terrible night. High above the battlefield, Queen Isolde stood at her study window, having watched as much of the fighting as the darkness allowed, her hands pressed flat against the cold stone sill. She had heard, secondhand and already exaggerated through the excited whispers of frightened servants, the story of a torch that burned unnaturally bright, of a rogue wolf fleeing from flame as though from something far more dangerous than fire alone. There was no more room for doubt in her mind. The pattern was too exact, too perfectly matched to old stories she had heard only once, decades earlier, from an Emberfall elder who had described the rare gift carried by certain bloodlines within that pack, a gift tied to fire itself, passed down through generations of warriors who had once been among the most feared and respected fighters in the Northern Territories. Elena was not simply a survivor of the Emberfall massacre, she was a direct descendant of its warrior line, the kind of bloodline that made her not just a lost child in need of protection, but a living symbol of a pack that certain powerful enemies had worked very hard, 20 years ago, to erase completely from the world. Isolde closed her eyes, the weight of what she now knew pressing down on her, with the force of 2 decades of guilt finally demanding acknowledgement. She could delay no longer. The rogue attack, however it had truly begun, had made one thing devastatingly clear. Someone out there already suspected what Isolde had only just confirmed. And if that suspicion grew any stronger, Elena's life would be in far greater danger than a single night of battle at the Eastern Wall. Morning arrived gray and heavy over Blackthorn Castle, the aftermath of the attack visible in the trampled grass and scorched fence lines that guards worked to repair even as exhaustion weighed on every shoulder. Elena slept only a few restless hours before Charlotte gently shook her awake, insisting she eat something, and let Margaret look her over properly, despite Elena's protests that she felt fine. "You do not look fine," Charlotte said firmly, guiding her toward the kitchen with the same stubborn care she always showed. "You look like someone who fought off a rogue wolf with a torch and half a prayer, which, as it happens, is exactly what you did." The kitchen was busier than usual, servants trading breathless accounts of the previous night's battle as they worked, most of the stories already growing taller with each retelling. Elena caught fragments of her own actions described back to her in increasingly exaggerated terms, a torch that had burned like the sun itself, flames that had chased the rogue wolves back across the border on their own. She said nothing to correct or confirm any of it, too unsettled by her own memory of the event to trust her voice around the subject. Margaret examined her with quiet efficiency, checking for injuries beneath the soot and grime, her sharp eyes lingering thoughtfully on Elena's hands, as though searching for some visible sign of whatever had happened out there in the dark. "No burns," Margaret murmured, almost to herself. "No blisters, nothing at all, despite what I'm hearing about that torch." "I don't understand it either," Elena admitted quietly, keeping her voice low enough that only Margaret would hear over the kitchen's morning noise. "It just happened, like something took over, and I wasn't fully in control of it." Margaret's expression grew serious, the teasing warmth she usually carried replaced by something more careful, more measured. "There are old stories, girl, about certain bloodlines carrying gifts beyond the ordinary. Fire-touched, some called them. Warriors who could call flame the way most of us call breath. I never put much stock in old stories until now. Fire-touched, Elena repeated, the words settling strangely in her chest, familiar somehow in a way she could not explain. Where did those stories come from? The North, mostly. Packs that don't exist anymore, if the old tales are true. Margaret shook her head, seeming to catch herself before saying more, and busied her hands with the bread again. Old stories, nothing more. Eat your breakfast before it goes cold. You've earned it, whatever the truth of what happened out there. Elena ate in distracted silence, her mind turning over Margaret's words long after the older woman had moved on to other tasks. Packs that don't exist anymore. Fire-touched bloodlines. The words fit together with the dream that had haunted her for years, the burning village, the woman's desperate voice calling her little flame, in a way that made her chest tighten with something between hope and dread. If there was truth buried somewhere in her forgotten past, she was no longer certain she wanted to uncover it alone. Across the castle grounds, Nathaniel led a small team through the trampled battlefield in the clear light of morning, examining the evidence left behind by the retreating rogue wolves, with the careful attention of a soldier who trusted his instincts more than convenient explanations. Most rogue attacks followed predictable patterns, opportunistic raids on unprotected livestock or careless scouts, easily explained by hunger or territorial disputes among wolves who had been cast out of their own packs. This attack had felt different from the start, too coordinated, too deliberately aimed at breaching the eastern wall specifically, rather than simply raiding whatever lay closest to the border. Nathaniel crouched near a cluster of broken arrows abandoned in the chaos, arrows that had not come from Blackthorn's own supplies. "These are not ours," he said, turning one over in his hands, examining the craftsmanship of the fletching. "And these rogues fought with more discipline than any pack of cast-outs I've encountered before. They retreated together, in formation, the moment their numbers thinned. That is not how starving, desperate wolves behave." One of his soldiers, a younger fighter named Edwin, knelt beside a patch of scorched grass, near the section of wall where Elena had made her stand. "There's something here, sir. Some kind of mark, burned into the ground." Nathaniel joined him, studying the strange symbol scorched into the earth, a shape that resembled a broken circle crossed through with jagged lines. He had never seen anything quite like it, though something about its deliberate, almost ceremonial precision suggested it was no accident of battle. "Sketch it," Nathaniel ordered, "carefully. I want to show this to the Queen before we show it to anyone else." He straightened, his gaze drifting toward the section of scorched wall where the servant girl had apparently fought off a wolf twice her size, with nothing but a torch and desperate courage. Whatever was happening within Blackthorn territory, he was increasingly certain it was not the random misfortune of rogue wolves testing weak defenses. Someone had orchestrated this attack with a very specific purpose in mind, and the timing, arriving so soon after Elena's warning, and so soon after the mysterious fire in the West Wing storage room, felt far too deliberate to dismiss as coincidence. By midday, word had reached Damien's private council chamber of the strange symbol found near the eastern wall, and he studied Nathaniel's hurried sketch with a deepening frown, turning the parchment slowly in his hands, as though the answer might reveal itself through careful enough examination. "You've seen this before?" he asked, glancing up at his second-in-command. "No, Your Majesty, but I intend to find out what it means, and quickly." Nathaniel hesitated, choosing his next words with unusual care. "There is something else you should know. The servant girl, Elena. Whatever she did with that torch last night, it was not an accident of adrenaline or desperate improvisation. Corwin swears her eyes changed color during the fight, the same way witnesses claim they did during the fire 2 nights ago. And the flame itself behaved in ways no ordinary fire should." Damien set the parchment down slowly, his mind already turning over the pieces of a puzzle that had begun forming 3 days earlier, and now seemed determined to demand his full attention. He thought of his mother's uncharacteristic interest in a simple servant's background, an interest he had noticed in passing but not yet questioned. He thought of the strange, deliberate symbol scorched into the earth, and the arrows that did not belong to any pack he recognized. "Send for my mother," he said finally. "I believe it is time she explained why she has taken such particular interest in a servant girl, who apparently carries fire in her blood." Nathaniel bowed and departed to deliver the summons, leaving Damien alone with his thoughts, and the strange, unsettled feeling that had been building in his chest since the moment Elena's eyes first met his, across a burning courtyard. He was a man who valued order, clarity, the steady, predictable rhythm of duty and rule. Everything about the past 3 days had unsettled that order in ways he was only beginning to understand, and something told him, with the same certainty Nathaniel had described in Elena's warning the night before, that the answers waiting to be uncovered would change far more than a simple mystery about a servant's unusual abilities. They would change everything he thought he understood about his own kingdom, and quite possibly about himself. Queen Isolde arrived at her son's council chamber within the hour, composed as always, though Damien had learned to read the small signs of tension beneath her practiced calm, the way her hands folded a fraction too tightly, the way her chin lifted slightly higher when she was preparing to defend something she did not wish to explain. "You summoned me," she said, taking the seat across from him, without waiting for invitation, a habit left over from years of advising his father, before Damien had ever worn the crown himself. "Nathaniel tells me you have taken a particular interest in a servant girl," Damien said, watching her face carefully as he spoke. "Elena Voss. He mentions you examined a scar on her shoulder personally, and that your reaction to it was significant." Something flickered behind Isolde's storm-gray eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared, though not quickly enough to escape her son's notice. "Servants sometimes remind us of people from the past. It was nothing more than an old memory catching me off guard. And the symbol found scorched into the ground near the eastern wall last night? Does that also remind you of an old memory?" Isolde's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for Damien to see the truth flickering beneath it before she could smooth it back into place. "What symbol?" Damien slid Nathaniel's sketch across the table toward her. He watched, unblinking, as his mother's face drained of color the moment her eyes landed on the broken circle crossed through with jagged lines, watched her hands tremble as she reached out to touch the parchment, as though it might burn her. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Scorched into the ground where a servant girl fought off a rogue wolf using a torch that burned unnaturally bright. A servant girl whose scar you examined, with an intensity Nathaniel describes as closer to shock than curiosity." Damien leaned forward, his voice hardening. "Mother, I have given you every courtesy of privacy regarding your own affairs since Father died, but something dangerous is unfolding within our territory, and if you know something that could protect the people I am responsible for, I need you to tell me now." Isolde closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them again, Damien saw something in her expression he had rarely witnessed in his entire life. Fear. Genuine, unguarded fear. The kind she had spent decades training herself never to show in front of anyone, least of all her own son. "There are things about the past," she said slowly, each word chosen with visible care, "that I have kept hidden for 20 years, believing it was the safest choice for everyone involved. I am no longer certain that silence protects anyone anymore. But I cannot explain this to you piece by piece, Damien. There is someone else who deserves to hear the full truth before you do. Someone who has lived her entire life without knowing who she truly is." Damien's jaw tightened, understanding settling over him with the weight of inevitability. "Elena." "Yes," Isolde said quietly. "Give me time to speak with her properly, alone, before this becomes a matter for the entire court to dissect and speculate over. She deserves that much at least, after a lifetime of being denied the truth about her own existence." Damien studied his mother for a long moment, torn between his duty to understand the threat facing his pack and a reluctant respect for the plea in her voice, a vulnerability he so rarely saw from the woman who had raised him to value control above almost everything else. "You have 3 days, he said finally. "After that, I involve myself directly, with or without your blessing." Isolde nodded, some of the tension easing from her shoulders, though the fear in her eyes did not fully fade. "Thank you." She left the council chamber with unusual haste, and Damien remained behind, staring at the strange symbol on the parchment before him, aware that whatever truth his mother was preparing to reveal, it would not be a small or simple one. That evening, as Elena carried a stack of freshly laundered linens toward the private wing of the castle, she found Queen Isolde waiting for her in the empty corridor outside the royal chambers, her expression carrying a gravity that made Elena's steps slow with instinctive unease. "Your Majesty," Elena said, offering a bow, though something in Isolde's posture suggested formality was not what this moment called for. "Walk with me," Isolde said instead. "There is somewhere private we should speak, and something I have delayed telling you for far too long." Elena's heart began to race, an echo of the same wrongness she had felt the night before the attack, though this feeling carried a different weight entirely, less like danger, and more like the ground, shifting slowly beneath her feet, preparing to open into something vast and unknown. She set down the linens and followed the queen through quiet corridors lit by flickering torchlight, past the formal rooms reserved for court business, and into a smaller, more private chamber Elena had never entered before, a room lined with old portraits and a single locked chest positioned prominently beneath the window. Isolde closed the door behind them and turned to face Elena directly, her storm-gray eyes searching the younger woman's face with an intensity that made Elena want to look away, and yet held her in place all the same. 20 years ago, Isolde began, her voice steady, despite the visible effort it seemed to cost her. There was a pack in the northern territories, called Emberfall. They were known throughout the northern lands for a rare and powerful gift, carried through certain bloodlines within their pack, a connection to fire itself that made their warriors among the most feared and respected fighters anyone had ever encountered. Elena's chest tightened, the word Emberfall settling into her like a stone, dropped into still water, sending ripples through memories she had never been able to fully access. That pack was destroyed, Isolde continued, in a single terrible night, by enemies who feared the power their bloodline represented. I was there, Elena. I witnessed the aftermath, the devastation, the loss that history has since recorded as nothing more than a tragic accident. For 20 years, I believed every member of that royal bloodline had perished in the flames that night. Why are you telling me this? Elena asked, though some quiet, frightened part of her already suspected the answer, had perhaps suspected it since the moment Isolde first examined her scar with such shocked, searching eyes. Isolde reached out and gently touched Elena's shoulder, just above where the flame-shaped scar lay hidden beneath her sleeve. Because I no longer believe every member of that bloodline perished, Elena. I believe one small child survived, hidden and protected in ways I still do not fully understand, and grew up not knowing who she truly was. Elena's breath caught, her whole body suddenly cold despite the warmth of the room. You think I am from Emberfall. I do not simply think it, Isolde said, her voice breaking slightly for the first time. The scar on your shoulder, the fire-touched gift you displayed last night at the eastern wall, the dreams I suspect you have carried for years of a burning village, and a voice calling you by a name that was never truly Elena. I have carried the guilt of that massacre for 20 years, believing I failed to save anyone that night. If I am right about who you are, then I did not fail entirely. Someone survived. Someone I am looking at right now, standing in this very room. The weight of the revelation crashed over Elena all at once. Decades of unanswered questions, unexplained instincts, unexplained scars and dreams and feelings she had never been able to name, suddenly threatening to coalesce into an answer too large and too impossible for her mind to fully accept. I don't understand, Elena whispered, her voice trembling. I have no family, no name beyond the one the orphan house gave me. How can I possibly be the heir to a pack that no longer exists? Because bloodlines do not disappear simply because history chooses to forget them, Isolde said gently. And because the child I believe you once were did not disappear either, Elena. She survived, against every terrible odds, and grew into the young woman standing before me now. Elena sank slowly onto a nearby chair, her legs no longer entirely steady beneath her, the room seeming to tilt and reshape itself around a truth she had never once imagined might exist. Emberfall, fire-touched. A princess, perhaps, though the word felt absurd, applied to a servant girl who had spent 2 years polishing tables and folding linens without anyone sparing her a second glance. If this is true, Elena said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, then why would anyone attack the eastern wall last night? Why now, after 20 years of believing everyone from Emberfall was already gone? Isolde's expression darkened, the fear Damien had glimpsed earlier resurfacing in full. Because I believe someone else has begun to suspect the same truth I have only just confirmed. The symbol found scorched into the ground near the wall, it belonged to the alliance responsible for destroying Emberfall in the first place. If they have found you, Elena, then the danger you face is far greater than a single night's attack. Elena stared at her hands, the same hands that had somehow called flame from an ordinary torch the night before, and felt, for the first time in her entire remembered life, the terrifying and overwhelming weight of a truth too large to carry alone. "What do I do now?" she asked quietly. "I don't know how to be someone I've never known myself to be." Isolde knelt beside her chair, taking Elena's trembling hands in her own, with a gentleness that surprised them both. "You do not have to become anything you are not ready for. Not tonight, and not tomorrow. For now, we protect you, quietly, while we learn more about who is hunting for you, and why they have waited 20 years to resume their search." "The king," Elena said suddenly, panic rising in her chest. "Does he know? He suspects something significant is happening. He does not yet know the full truth, though I promised him an answer within 3 days." Isolde's gaze softened with something close to sympathy. "I know this is a great deal to carry, Elena, especially alongside whatever feelings may have already begun growing between yourself and my son." Heat rushed to Elena's cheeks, despite the gravity of the moment. "There is nothing between us, Your Majesty. He barely knows my name." "He knows your name," Isolde said, a small knowing smile briefly softening her worried expression. "I have watched my son avoid looking at people he finds unimportant for his entire life, Elena. He has not once managed to avoid looking at you these past 3 days, however hard he has tried." Elena did not know how to respond to that, her mind still too overwhelmed by the larger revelation to fully process the smaller one, though something warm and cautiously hopeful stirred beneath the fear and confusion crowding her thoughts. "What happens next?" she asked instead, focusing on the question that felt more manageable to face. "For now, you continue your duties as before, so as not to draw suspicion from anyone watching closely, including Lady Seraphine, whose interest in you already borders on concerning." Isolde rose, moving toward the locked chest beneath the window, retrieving a small brass key from a chain hidden beneath her gown. "But I want you to have something, Elena, something that belonged to your mother." Elena's breath caught. "My mother?" Isolde unlocked the chest and withdrew a small, delicate pendant, a flame carved from deep red stone, hanging from a fine silver chain. She placed it carefully in Elena's palm, closing the younger woman's fingers gently around it. "This was recovered from the ruins of Emberfall 20 years ago, among the few possessions that survived the fire. I have kept it safe all this time, hoping against reason that someday it might find its way back to someone who could rightfully claim it. I believe that person is you." Elena stared down at the pendant, warmth radiating faintly from the stone despite the coolness of the room, and felt something shift deep inside her chest, a recognition too old and too instinctive to be explained by memory alone. Tears gathered in her eyes before she fully understood why, grief for a mother she could not consciously remember, and a strange, fragile comfort at holding something that had once belonged to a life she had lost without ever truly knowing it existed. "Thank you," she whispered, closing her fingers tightly around the pendant. "Keep it hidden, for now," Isolde advised gently. "Until we understand more about the danger surrounding us, it is safer if very few people know what you carry, both in blood and in truth." Elena nodded, tucking the pendant carefully beneath her collar, close against her heart where the flame-shaped scar rested just beneath the fabric. The two symbols together, one old and permanent, one newly returned to her after 20 years, felt like the first real proof she had ever held that her life before the orphan house had not simply been an empty, unknowable void. She left the private chamber that evening changed in ways she could not fully articulate, walking the familiar corridors of Blackthorn Castle with new eyes, aware suddenly that the walls around her held histories and connections she had never once suspected, and that the invisible life she had built for herself as an anonymous servant girl was beginning, slowly and irreversibly, to unravel into something far larger and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined possible. As she passed through the East Hall on her way back to the servant quarters, she nearly collided with Damien, who had apparently been waiting, whether by coincidence or deliberate intention she could not immediately tell, near the entrance to the private wing. He studied her face carefully, taking in the visible traces of tears she had not fully managed to hide, the new tension in her posture that had not been there hours earlier. "Are you well?" he asked, his voice carrying a gentleness that caught her entirely off guard, so different from the cool, formal tone he usually reserved for anyone beneath his rank. "I will be," Elena said carefully, unsure how much she was permitted to reveal, unsure even now how much she herself fully understood. "Your mother and I spoke about some difficult things." Damien's dark eyes searched her face for a long moment, and she had the distinct sense that he wanted to ask more, wanted to push past the careful boundary she had drawn around the conversation. And yet something in her expression must have convinced him to hold back. "If you ever need anything," he said instead, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, "you may come to me directly, regardless of rank, regardless of formality. I mean that, Elena." It was the first time he had ever spoken her name aloud in her presence, and hearing it in his voice sent an unexpected warmth through her chest that had nothing to do with the pendant hidden beneath her collar. She managed a small, uncertain smile, the first genuine smile she had offered anyone since walking into Isolde's private chamber. "Thank you, Your Majesty." "Damien," he corrected softly. "When it is only the two of us, you may call me Damien." She nodded, too overwhelmed to trust her voice further, and continued past him, toward the servant quarters, her mind spinning with questions that had no easy answers, her heart carrying the strange, fragile weight of a truth too enormous to fully believe, and a growing warmth toward a king who was quickly becoming far more than simply the man she once thought never noticed her at all. Behind her, Damien remained standing in the corridor a long while, watching the space where she had disappeared from view, aware that whatever his mother was preparing to reveal, it had already begun to change something fundamental in the careful, controlled world he had built for himself since the day he first wore his father's crown. The days that followed settled into a strange new rhythm, one where Elena continued her ordinary duties by daylight, folding linens and polishing tables exactly as she had for 2 years, while carrying beneath her collar a secret so enormous it sometimes made her hands shake in the quiet moments when no one else was watching. Isolde kept her promise of discretion, meeting with Elena in private whenever their schedules allowed, slowly filling in fragments of the past that Elena's own memory could not reach on its own, stories of the Emberfall pack, of warriors who could call flame from nothing but will and blood, of a mother whose name Isolde still would not reveal, insisting the full truth should come only when Elena was ready to bear the whole weight of it at once. What neither of them expected was how quickly Damien would begin finding reasons to seek Elena out, small excuses that grew less convincing with each passing day. He would appear in the East Hall during her afternoon duties, claiming urgent business that somehow always resolved itself within minutes of arriving. He would linger near the kitchen entrance when she carried trays to the dining hall, offering brief, quiet conversation that had nothing to do with kingdom matters and everything to do with simply wanting to know her better. "You hum when you work," he observed one afternoon, catching her mid-task in the East Hall, as she arranged fresh flowers along the long banquet table. "I noticed it the first time I truly looked at you, the night of the fire. You do it without realizing, I think." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassed to have been caught in a habit she rarely noticed in herself. "It helps me focus. Charlotte teases me about it constantly." "Don't stop on my account," Damien said, and something in his voice, warmer and more unguarded than she had ever heard from him, made her chest tighten with a feeling she was still learning to recognize. It's a pleasant sound in a castle that too often feels cold and formal. Their conversations grew longer as the days passed, stolen moments between duties and council meetings, careful and quiet enough to avoid the notice of the wider court, though not quite careful enough to escape everyone's attention. Charlotte noticed first, teasing Elena mercilessly each night as they prepared for bed, delighted by the flush that rose in her friend's cheeks whenever the king's name came up in conversation. "You are falling for him," Charlotte said one evening, grinning, despite Elena's insistent denials. "I've watched you avoid admitting it for a week now. It's rather sweet, honestly, watching two people so clearly drawn to each other, pretend otherwise for the sake of propriety." "It doesn't matter how I feel," Elena said, though the protest carried less conviction than it once had. "He is expected to choose a mate of noble blood before the next full moon. Whatever this is between us, it cannot go anywhere. It would be foolish to let myself hope otherwise." Charlotte's teasing expression softened into something more serious. "Foolish or not, hearts rarely listen to good sense, Elena. I've watched you smile more this past week than in the entire 2 years I've known you. Whatever happens next, that alone seems worth something." Elena did not have an answer for that, curling instead beneath her thin blanket, with the pendant still hidden beneath her nightclothes, warm against her skin, in a way that had become strangely comforting over the past days, a physical reminder of a truth and a heritage she was still learning to understand. Not everyone in the castle shared Charlotte's warmth toward the growing, unspoken connection between the king and the servant girl. Lady Seraphine had noticed the pattern of Damien's visits to the East Hall, with sharp, calculating attention, her initial amusement at Elena's presumed foolishness, curdling quickly into something far more dangerous, as the days wore on, and Damien's interest showed no sign of fading. "He has visited that hall 4 times this week," Seraphine said to her closest confidant, a noblewoman named Vivian, as they walked together through the castle gardens one afternoon, their voices low despite the privacy of the empty pathway. 4 times, Vivian, for a servant girl with no name and no bloodline worth mentioning. "It is becoming an embarrassment. Perhaps he simply enjoys the flowers she arranges," Vivian offered, though her tone made clear she did not believe her own suggestion. "Do not be naive," Seraphine snapped, her composure cracking briefly, before she smoothed it back into place. "I have worked for 2 years to secure my position as the obvious choice for his mate. I will not lose that position to some nameless servant, simply because she managed to survive a fire and a rogue attack through nothing more than dumb luck. What will you do?" Seraphine's eyes narrowed, calculating possibilities, with the same cold efficiency she applied to every advantage she had ever pursued in her life. "I will remind the court, and the king himself, exactly what she is, and exactly what she is not. A servant does not become a queen simply because a lonely king momentarily forgets his duty to his bloodline and his people." She said nothing more on the matter that day, but the seed of her plan had already begun to take root, growing quietly alongside the very connection she intended to destroy, unaware that the truth of Elena's own bloodline, hidden still beneath careful secrecy, would eventually render every one of her assumptions about rank and worth entirely, irrevocably wrong. That evening, during a formal gathering to welcome envoys from a neighboring pack, Seraphine made her first move, choosing her moment with the precision of someone who had spent years learning exactly how to wound without leaving visible marks. As Elena moved through the hall refilling cups exactly as she had a week earlier, Seraphine intercepted her path with a smile that did not reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Elena, is it?" she said, loud enough for several nearby nobles to overhear. "I understand the king has taken quite an interest in your company lately. How charming that a servant girl should catch the eye of royalty, however briefly such interest tends to last." Elena kept her expression carefully neutral, though her pulse quickened at the deliberate cruelty layered beneath the polite words. "I serve the king and his household as I am asked, my lady. Nothing more." "Of course," Seraphine said, her smile widening. "Though I do wonder, does it not embarrass you, knowing that whatever attention he offers now will mean nothing once the elders finalize the mate ceremony? A king's fleeting curiosity is hardly the same as genuine regard, especially when directed toward someone so far beneath his station." The words landed with precise, deliberate cruelty, drawing quiet laughter from several nobles standing nearby, and Elena felt her cheeks burn with humiliation she was, once again, not permitted to show. She opened her mouth to offer some careful, deflecting response, though before she could speak, a familiar voice cut through the tension with quiet, unmistakable authority. "Lady Seraphine." Damien had crossed the hall without either woman noticing his approach, his expression carrying a coldness Elena had rarely seen, directed at anyone within the court. "I would advise care in how you speak to members of my household, regardless of their rank." Seraphine's confident smile faltered, though she recovered quickly, offering a graceful curtsy. "Forgive me, Your Majesty. I meant no true offense. I only observed how much attention you have shown her lately, and wondered aloud what such attention might mean for her future." "Her future," Damien said evenly, "is not a subject for court gossip, nor is my own conduct, Lady Seraphine, a matter for you to question in public settings." His gaze shifted briefly to Elena, softening almost imperceptibly, before returning to its cool formality, as he addressed Seraphine once more. "I trust you understand me clearly." Seraphine's composure held, barely, though the flash of anger in her eyes told Elena everything she needed to know about how this small, public defeat would be received once the noblewoman retreated to plan her next move. "Perfectly clearly, Your Majesty." She retreated toward the far end of the hall, and Elena, still reeling from the exchange, found Damien's dark eyes settled on her with quiet concern. "Are you all right?" "I am used to worse," Elena admitted quietly, though the admission did little to ease the tightness in her chest. "You did not need to defend me. It only draws more attention to something that will only bring me trouble in the end." "I could not simply stand by and watch her speak to you that way," Damien said, his voice low enough that only she would hear. "Whatever trouble it brings, I do not regret it." Elena did not have a response for the warmth that spread through her chest at his words, though somewhere across the hall, she caught Seraphine watching them both with an expression of cold, calculating fury that promised this quiet moment of defense would not go unanswered for long. Later that night, after the envoys had retired and the great hall had emptied of its formal noise, Damien found Elena alone in the castle gardens, sitting on a low stone bench beneath an old oak tree, the pendant beneath her collar catching faint moonlight where it had slipped free during her walk. He approached slowly, giving her every opportunity to retreat if she wished, though she only shifted slightly to make room for him on the bench, a small gesture that felt, to both of them, like something significant. "You come here often," Damien observed, settling beside her, close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed hers. "When I need to think," Elena admitted. "It's quiet. No one expects anything of me here." "I expect nothing of you here either," Damien said, "except perhaps your company, if you're willing to offer it." She glanced at him sideways, studying the profile of a man who, only a week earlier, had walked past her in the corridors without a single glance of true recognition. Something had shifted between them since the fire, since the attack at the eastern wall, since the strange, secret truths that had begun reshaping her understanding of her own existence. She was not yet ready to share that truth with him, mindful of Isolde's warning about the danger that still surrounded her, but she found she wanted, more than she had wanted almost anything in her adult life, to simply sit beside him, in comfortable silence, beneath the old oak tree. "May I ask you something?" she said finally. "Of course." "Why me? You could have any noblewoman in this kingdom vying for your attention, and instead you spend your evenings finding excuses to visit the East Hall, or wander the gardens hoping to find a servant girl deep in thought." She kept her voice light, though the question carried genuine weight beneath its casual delivery. Damien was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer with the same careful deliberation he brought to matters of state. "I have spent 3 years as Alpha King, surrounded by people who want something from me. Land, favor, position, alliance through marriage. Every conversation I have with the nobility carries an agenda beneath its surface, however carefully hidden." He turned to look at her directly, his dark eyes carrying an openness she had never seen from him before. "You have never once asked me for anything, Elena. Not favor, not position, not even simple kindness. You simply exist, honestly and without pretense, and somehow that has become the rarest thing I have encountered in this entire castle." Elena's throat tightened with emotion she did not fully know how to name. "I never expected anything from you. I still don't." "I know," Damien said softly. "That is precisely why I find myself unable to stop thinking about you." The confession hung between them in the cool night air, honest and unguarded in a way neither of them had quite intended, and for a long moment neither spoke, simply sitting together beneath the old oak tree, while the castle settled into quiet nighttime stillness around them. Elena thought of the pendant hidden beneath her collar, of the truth she was not yet ready to share, of the danger Isolde had warned still surrounded her, and felt a familiar tightness of guilt settle over the warmth of the moment. "There are things about me you don't know," she said carefully, choosing her words with as much care as she dared. "Things I am not yet able to explain, even to myself fully." "I am not asking you to explain anything you are not ready to share," Damien said. "Whatever secrets you carry, Elena, I trust that you carry them for good reason. When you are ready, if you are ever ready, I will listen. Until then, I am content simply knowing you." The gentleness in his words nearly undid her composure entirely, and she found herself reaching, almost without deciding to, for his hand where it rested on the bench between them. He accepted the small gesture immediately, his fingers curling around hers with careful warmth, and they remained there a long while, beneath the old oak tree, saying nothing more, needing nothing more than the quiet comfort of each other's presence. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from a shadowed archway at the edge of the garden, nor the quiet, furious calculation already forming behind Lady Seraphine's narrowed eyes as she observed the tender scene unfolding beneath the tree. She had seen enough. Whatever hold this nameless servant girl had gained over the Alpha King, Seraphine intended to unravel it, thoroughly and permanently, before the situation grew any further beyond her control. The following morning, Seraphine summoned a private meeting with a man named Edric, a minor noble known throughout the court for his willingness to gather information for the right price, discretion guaranteed, regardless of how uncomfortable the truth he uncovered might prove to be. "I want everything you can find about a servant girl named Elena Voss," Seraphine instructed, sliding a small pouch of coin across the table between them. "Where she came from, who her family was, any detail at all about her life before she arrived at Blackthorn Castle." Edric raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by the unusual request. "A servant girl, my lady? Surely such a person has little worth investigating." "Let me worry about what she is worth," Seraphine said coldly. "You simply find the answers I require. I understand she arrived from an orphan house on the northern edge of our territory. That seems as reasonable a place to begin as any." Edric accepted the coin with a small, obliging bow. "I will have answers within the week, my lady." "See that you do," Seraphine said, already turning her attention away, satisfied that the wheels of her investigation had finally begun to turn. Whatever secrets Elena Voss carried, hidden beneath her quiet, unremarkable exterior, Seraphine intended to expose every single one of them, certain that whatever truth Edric uncovered would prove exactly what she already suspected, that Elena was nothing more than an ordinary, forgettable servant girl who had somehow, through luck or manipulation, captured a king's fleeting and misplaced attention. She could not have imagined, in her most calculating moments, how catastrophically wrong that assumption would prove to be, nor how the investigation she had ordered out of jealousy and wounded pride would ultimately set in motion events far larger and far more dangerous than a simple rivalry over a king's affection. Edric proved faster than Seraphine expected, returning within 4 days rather than the promised week, his usual smug confidence replaced by something closer to unease, as he laid a thin folder of notes across the table between them. "I found less than you hoped, my lady, and more than I expected," he said carefully. "The orphan house matron remembers the girl arriving nearly 16 years ago, found wandering alone, near the northern border, unable to speak for almost a year afterward. No family ever came forward to claim her. No records exist of her birth, her parents, or where exactly she came from before that day." Seraphine frowned, skimming the sparse notes with obvious dissatisfaction. "That tells me nothing useful." "There is one detail the matron mentioned that struck me as unusual," Edric continued. "She said the girl arrived from the direction of the old Emberfall territory. The ruins, specifically, though the matron assumed at the time that the child had simply wandered lost through the forest and happened to emerge from that direction by coincidence." The word Emberfall settled into the room with unexpected weight, and Seraphine's frown deepened into something more calculating. She had heard the old stories, as every noble family had, whispered warnings about a pack destroyed 20 years earlier, under circumstances the official histories described only vaguely as tragic misfortune. She had never given the stories much thought beyond idle court gossip, the kind of half-remembered history that meant little to a young noblewoman focused on securing her own future. "You believe this is significant?" she asked. "I believe," Edric said carefully, "that the Queen has taken an unusual interest in this same servant girl in recent days, according to palace gossip I overheard while conducting my inquiry. And I believe that Emberfall was not simply destroyed by misfortune, my lady, whatever the official histories claim. There are those who remember that night differently, who whisper of enemies and betrayal rather than accident." Seraphine sat back in her chair, turning the pieces over in her mind with growing, dangerous fascination. If there was truth to the connection between Elena and the fallen pack of Emberfall, the implications reached far beyond a simple servant capturing a king's fleeting attention. If Elena carried noble, even royal blood from a pack once considered among the most powerful in the northern territories, then her presence at Blackthorn Castle represented something far more threatening to Seraphine's ambitions than mere jealousy over misplaced affection. It represented a genuine rival for the throne itself. "Keep investigating," Seraphine instructed, sliding another pouch of coin across the table. "I want to know everything about that night 20 years ago, and I want to know who exactly the Queen suspects this girl to be." Edric bowed and departed, and Seraphine remained alone in the quiet meeting room, turning the strange new information over in her calculating mind, already beginning to reshape her plans around this unexpected complication. If Elena truly carried Emberfall blood, exposing that truth publicly, before Elena or the Crown was prepared to control the narrative, could prove far more damaging than any simple rumor about inappropriate royal favor. A servant girl caught in a king's fleeting affection was easily dismissed and forgotten. A hidden heir to a destroyed royal bloodline, secretly protected within the walls of Blackthorn Castle, was a political scandal capable of shaking the entire pack's stability, and Seraphine intended to control exactly how and when that scandal became known to the wider court. Meanwhile, unaware of the danger gathering around her in the form of Seraphine's growing investigation, Elena continued the delicate balance of her days, serving quietly by daylight while meeting secretly with Isolde in the evenings, to slowly piece together the fragments of her forgotten past. Isolde had begun teaching her small exercises meant to help her understand and eventually control the fire-touched gift that had twice now surfaced under moments of extreme danger, insisting that a warrior's bloodline deserved training rather than fear. "Close your eyes," Isolde instructed one evening, standing with Elena in a private, secluded corner of the castle grounds, far from curious eyes. "Feel for the warmth in your chest, the same warmth that guided your hands the night of the attack. It is not something to summon through force. It responds to instinct, to emotion, to genuine need." Elena closed her eyes, focusing inward the way Isolde had taught her over the past several evenings, searching for the strange warmth that had surged through her during the fire and the rogue attack. At first, she felt nothing but the ordinary quiet of her own heartbeat, though gradually, as she relaxed into the exercise, a faint ember of heat stirred somewhere deep in her chest, small and uncertain, like a candle flame struggling against a draft. "I feel something," she said softly, eyes still closed. "It's small, fragile." "That is enough for now," Isolde said, warmth and pride evident in her voice. "Control comes slowly, through practice and patience, not through force. You have carried this gift dormant within you for 16 years without any guidance at all. It will take time to learn to wield it properly." Elena opened her eyes, meeting Isolde's steady gaze with a small, grateful smile. In the weeks since the revelation of her true heritage, she had come to rely on these quiet evening sessions, not just for the training itself, but for the growing warmth of connection she felt toward the woman who had become, in many ways, the closest thing to a mother she had ever known. "Thank you," Elena said, "for all of this, for trusting me with the truth, and for teaching me to understand it." "You are the daughter of a pack I failed to save 20 years ago," Isolde said quietly. "Teaching you to survive and thrive despite that failure is the very least I owe you, Elena. Whatever comes next, whatever danger still gathers around us, I intend to see you protected and whole, whatever the cost to myself." The words carried a weight of promise that Elena did not yet fully understand, though she would remember them clearly in the difficult days ahead, when the full cost of Isolde's devotion would finally become impossible to ignore, and when the quiet, careful secret they had worked so hard to protect would begin, piece by piece, to unravel in ways neither of them could have fully anticipated. That unraveling began sooner than anyone expected. 2 days later, Edric returned to Seraphine, with information far more damning than anything either of them had anticipated, information gathered through a bribed guard, who had overheard fragments of conversation between Nathaniel and Damien regarding the strange symbol found at the eastern wall. "The symbol matches records of an old alliance," Edric reported, his voice low despite the privacy of the meeting room. "An alliance formed specifically to hunt down and destroy any surviving members of the Emberfall bloodline after the massacre 20 years ago. If your servant girl truly carries that blood, my lady, then someone within that alliance already suspects her existence, and the attack at the eastern wall was no accident of rogue wolves. It was a deliberate hunt." Seraphine absorbed this information with cold, calculating focus, weighing the political implications with the same careful precision she applied to every advantage in her life. If Elena's identity became public knowledge before Seraphine could control the narrative, The resulting chaos could easily destroy any remaining chance she had of securing her position as Damien's chosen mate, especially if the revelation cast Elena in a sympathetic light, as a tragic, hunted heir, rather than a manipulative servant seeking favor above her station. But if Seraphine acted first, exposing the truth on her own terms, before Elena or the crown had prepared their own narrative, she could potentially reshape the entire situation to her advantage, painting Elena not as a tragic heir deserving protection, but as a dangerous, deceptive outsider who had infiltrated the castle under false pretenses, endangering the entire pack through her mere presence. "I want to see the elders," Seraphine said finally, her decision made. "Tonight, before the king or the queen have any opportunity to control how this information reaches the wider court." Edric hesitated, a flicker of genuine concern crossing his usually confident expression. "My lady, if this girl truly carries Emberfall blood, exposing her prematurely could place her in far greater danger than she already faces. The alliance that destroyed her pack once may still be watching, waiting for exactly this kind of public confirmation." "That is not my concern," Seraphine said coldly. "My concern is securing my own future, and I will not allow a nameless servant girl, however tragic her true heritage may be, to steal what I have worked years to secure." She dismissed Edric with a curt wave and began preparing for the evening ahead, rehearsing carefully how she would frame the revelation before the assembled elders, choosing each word for maximum political effect, entirely indifferent to the danger her actions might bring crashing down upon a young woman who had done nothing more than survive a tragedy she had never chosen and could barely remember. That evening, as the elders gathered for their regular council session, Seraphine requested permission to address the assembly on a matter of, as she described it, urgent concern for the security and stability of the pack. Damien, seated at the head of the long council table, granted her request with visible reluctance, some instinct warning him that whatever Seraphine intended to reveal would not serve any purpose beneficial to those he cared about. "I have recently learned troubling information," Seraphine began, her voice carrying easily through the hushed council chamber, "regarding the true identity of a servant currently residing within this very castle, a servant who has, in recent weeks, gained unusual and inappropriate favor from our king." Damien's expression hardened immediately, understanding exactly where this was heading, though he could do nothing to stop the momentum Seraphine had already set into motion before an audience of powerful elders who would not appreciate being publicly interrupted. "This servant, known to the household as Elena Voss, is believed by certain members of this court," Seraphine continued, her gaze flicking pointedly toward Queen Isolde, seated near her son, "to be a surviving heir of the Emberfall bloodline, destroyed 20 years ago, under circumstances our own histories have never fully explained." A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the council chamber, elders exchanging alarmed glances, several rising partially from their seats in visible agitation. Elder Edmund, the oldest and most respected among them, leaned forward with sharp, searching eyes fixed on Isolde. "Is this true, Your Majesty?" he demanded. "Have you knowingly harbored a survivor of Emberfall within these walls, without informing this council of such a significant and potentially dangerous development?" Isolde's composure remained remarkably steady, despite the sudden, unwelcome exposure of a secret she had worked so carefully to protect. "I believed, and still believe, that Elena's safety required discretion until we better understood the threat surrounding her. The attack at the eastern wall 2 weeks ago was no random incident. It was a deliberate hunt, orchestrated by an alliance responsible for Emberfall's destruction 20 years ago. And you chose to keep this from your own council, Your Majesty, while allowing your son to grow openly attached to a young woman whose very presence apparently invites attacks against this pack?" Seraphine pressed, her voice carrying a note of righteous indignation that Damien recognized, with growing fury, as entirely calculated rather than genuine. "Enough," Damien said, his voice cutting through the rising tension with commanding authority. "Whatever Elena's heritage may be, she has done nothing to endanger this pack beyond the simple, unchosen circumstance of surviving a tragedy that was never her fault. If enemies have followed her here, the fault lies with them, not with an innocent woman who has spent her entire life unaware of who she truly was." "With respect, Your Majesty," Elder Edmund said carefully, "a king's personal feelings cannot outweigh the security concerns her presence raises for this entire pack. If this Emberfall alliance believes she resides within our walls, we may find ourselves facing further attacks, potentially far more severe than the single skirmish we have already endured. The council chamber erupted into heated debate, elders arguing amongst themselves about the appropriate course of action, some advocating for Elena's immediate removal from the castle for the pack's safety, others urging caution against abandoning an innocent woman to enemies who had already once tried to destroy her entire bloodline. Damien sat through the escalating argument with visible tension, his jaw tight, his hands clenched against the table's edge, aware that whatever decision the council eventually reached, the quiet, careful protection he and his mother had tried to offer Elena had just been shattered beyond any hope of repair. Seraphine, watching the chaos she had deliberately unleashed with quiet, satisfied composure, allowed herself the smallest hint of a triumphant smile. Whatever happened next, whether the council chose to protect Elena or cast her out, Seraphine had accomplished her primary goal. The nameless servant girl who had somehow captured a king's affection now stood exposed before the entire court, her secret laid bare, her simple, quiet life shattered beyond any possibility of return to the invisible existence she had once known. What Seraphine did not fully understand, in the satisfaction of her carefully orchestrated revelation, was that exposing Elena's identity had not simply threatened a servant girl's quiet secret. It had potentially handed the enemies of Emberfall exactly the confirmation they needed to locate their final target, setting into motion a chain of events that would soon threaten far more than a single young woman's safety, reaching instead toward the very stability of Blackthorn Pack itself. Word of the council's heated debate spread through the castle faster than Damien could contain it, servants whispering the story in hushed, excited tones as they went about their duties the following morning. By midday, Elena could feel the weight of 100 curious, suspicious stares, following her through every corridor she walked. The quiet anonymity she had relied upon for 2 years shattered completely, replaced by an exposure she had never wanted and did not know how to bear. Charlotte found her hiding in the linen storage room, knees drawn to her chest, tears streaking silently down her face, despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Everyone knows," Elena whispered when Charlotte knelt beside her. "Everyone is looking at me like I'm some kind of ghost, or some kind of threat. I never asked for any of this, Charlotte. I never wanted to be anything other than ordinary." "You were never ordinary," Charlotte said gently, wrapping an arm around her friend's shoulders. "Whatever blood runs through you, Elena, you are still the same woman who ran into a burning room to save a child, who spoke up about danger even when no one believed her, who has shown nothing but kindness to everyone in this castle for 2 years. That does not change, simply because people now know a name for the family you were born into." Elena managed a small, watery smile, grateful beyond words for the steady loyalty of her friend, though the comfort did little to ease the deeper fear settling into her chest, the fear of enemies who had already once tried to erase her entire bloodline from existence, now armed with confirmation that she still lived. Her fears proved justified faster than anyone anticipated. That very night, as the castle settled into uneasy quiet following the day's dramatic revelations, a small group of unfamiliar figures were spotted, moving through the forest bordering the castle's western wall, their approach far more careful and coordinated than the chaotic rogue attack from 2 weeks earlier. Nathaniel received the report from a border scout just past midnight, and within minutes, he had roused Damien from his private chambers, both men moving with the swift, focused urgency of soldiers who understood exactly what kind of threat they now faced. "They're not rogues this time," Nathaniel said grimly, unrolling a hastily sketched map of the western approach across Damien's desk. "Scout reports describe organized movement, disciplined formation, exactly the kind of coordinated assault we'd expect from trained fighters, rather than desperate outcasts. This is the alliance Isolde warned us about." "How many?" Damien asked, already reaching for his own weapons, his mind shifting immediately into the cold, focused calculation of a commander preparing for battle. "Scouts count at least 20, possibly more, hidden in the darker sections of the tree line. Small enough to move quietly, large enough to overwhelm a standard patrol if they catch us unprepared." Damien's jaw tightened. "Their target is Elena." "Almost certainly," Nathaniel confirmed. "Given the timing, given everything we now know about the alliance responsible for Emberfall's destruction, I doubt this is coincidence." Seraphine's little revelation in council yesterday may have just handed our enemies exactly the confirmation they needed. Fury flashed hot and sudden through Damien's chest, directed as much at Seraphine's reckless, self-serving betrayal as at the enemies now advancing toward his walls. But there was no time for anger, not with an armed force closing in on his territory and the woman he had come, over these past weeks, to care for more deeply than he had ever expected possible, standing directly in their path. "Move Elena to the inner keep immediately," Damien ordered. "Full guard, no exceptions. I want every available fighter positioned along the western wall within the hour." Nathaniel moved to obey, and Damien followed close behind, his mind racing through strategies and contingencies, even as a quieter, more personal fear settled beneath his commander's focus, a fear he had not fully allowed himself to feel since the death of his father 3 years earlier. He could not lose her, not now, not after finally allowing himself to hope for something more than the cold, dutiful existence he had resigned himself to since the crown first settled on his shoulders. Elena was already awake when the guards arrived at the servant quarters, some instinct having roused her from restless sleep moments before the urgent knock came at her door. Charlotte woke beside her, immediately alert to the tension radiating from the guard's hurried explanation. "The king has ordered you moved to the inner keep," the lead guard said, his voice tight with barely controlled urgency. "There's a coordinated force approaching from the western tree line. We believe they're here for you." Elena's blood ran cold, though the fear that gripped her chest was tempered by something else entirely, a fierce, protective anger that surprised her with its intensity. She thought of the small, fragile warmth Isolde had taught her to find within her own chest, the fire-touched gift she had only begun to understand, and felt it stir now, no longer fragile, but building steadily with each passing heartbeat. "I want to help defend the wall," she said, surprising herself as much as the guard standing before her. "Absolutely not," the guard said immediately. "My orders are to move you to safety, not to place you directly in the path of the very enemies hunting for you." "If they're here for me," Elena argued, "then hiding does nothing but put everyone else at risk, while they search this castle to find me. I have a gift now, one I've been training with the queen these past weeks. Let me use it to help, rather than sitting helpless in the keep while others fight and possibly die because of who I am." The guard hesitated, clearly torn between his direct orders and the fierce determination in Elena's voice, though before the argument could continue further, Isolde herself arrived, having heard the commotion from her own chambers nearby. "She comes with me," Isolde said firmly, cutting through the guard's protest with the authority of a queen who had spent decades learning exactly how to be obeyed. "I will keep her safe within the keep, but close enough to the western defenses that her gift may still prove useful if the battle turns against us. Is that acceptable, Elena?" Elena nodded, grateful for the compromise, and the small group moved swiftly through the castle's inner corridors toward the keep, the growing sounds of distant commotion from the western wall, confirming that whatever force approached, it had already begun its assault on Blackthorn's outer defenses. The battle that followed was unlike anything Elena had witnessed during the earlier rogue attack. These enemies fought with cold, disciplined precision, advancing in coordinated waves, rather than the chaotic, desperate assault of starving outcasts. Damien led the defense personally, his own considerable fighting skill on full display, as he moved through the chaos with lethal, focused efficiency, rallying his guards and holding the line against an assault that seemed, for a long, terrifying stretch of the night, to be gradually overwhelming Blackthorn's defenses, despite everyone's best efforts. From a protected vantage point near the keep, Elena watched the battle unfold with growing, helpless horror, the warmth in her chest building steadily, as fear and desperation mixed together into something powerful and increasingly difficult to contain. When a group of enemy fighters broke through the western line, moving with clear purpose toward the very section of the keep where she stood, Isolde's protective barrier of guards found themselves suddenly, dangerously outnumbered. "Elena," Isolde said urgently, gripping her arm. "Now. Whatever you can offer, we need it now." Elena closed her eyes, reaching for the warmth Isolde had taught her to find, no longer fragile and uncertain, but blazing hot and urgent beneath the desperate need of the moment. When she opened her eyes again, they burned amber, bright and fierce, and the warmth in her chest surged outward through her hands, through her entire body, until flame itself seemed to answer her call. rising in a protective wall between the advancing enemies and the keep's vulnerable position. The enemy fighters recoiled from the sudden wall of flame, shock and fear replacing their earlier disciplined confidence, and in that brief, crucial opening, Blackthorn guards rallied, driving the stunned assault back toward the tree line with renewed ferocity. Damien, catching sight of the impossible wall of flame from across the battlefield, felt something between terror and awe grip his chest, understanding in that single, illuminating moment exactly what Elena truly was, and exactly what kind of power the ancient bloodline of Emberfall had once commanded before its destruction. The battle ended just before dawn, the coordinated enemy force finally retreating into the forest, leaving behind wounded guards, scorched earth, and a castle shaken to its foundations by an attack that had made devastatingly clear exactly how much danger Elena's true identity now placed upon everyone within Blackthorn's walls. As the exhausted defenders began the grim work of tending wounds and counting losses, Damien found Elena still standing near the keep, her amber eyes fading slowly back to their ordinary brown, her whole body trembling with the aftermath of power she had never before wielded on such a scale. He crossed the distance between them without hesitation, pulling her into an embrace that carried none of his usual careful restraint, simply grateful, in that raw and unguarded moment, that she had survived a night that could so easily have ended in devastating loss. "You saved us," he murmured against her hair. "You saved this entire castle tonight." "I nearly lost control," Elena whispered back, still shaking. "I don't know how much longer I could have held that flame before it consumed something I never intended to destroy." "But you held it," Damien said, pulling back just enough to meet her eyes directly. "You held it, and because of that, we are all still standing here tonight." His expression grew more serious, determination settling into the line of his jaw. "This cannot continue, Elena. Hiding your identity, hoping our enemies simply lose interest, waiting helplessly for the next attack. We need a different strategy, one that protects you properly, rather than leaving you exposed to danger every time our enemies decide to test our defenses." Elena nodded, understanding the truth in his words even as exhaustion and lingering fear made it difficult to fully process what such a strategy might require. Whatever came next, she understood, with growing certainty, that her quiet, invisible life as an ordinary servant girl had ended permanently the moment fire had first answered her desperate call, and that the path ahead, whatever shape it eventually took, would demand far more courage from her than she had ever previously believed herself capable of offering. The morning after the attack, Damien called an emergency council session, standing before the assembled elders with a hardness in his expression that silenced the room's nervous murmuring the moment he entered. Seraphine sat among the noble attendees near the back of the chamber, her earlier triumphant satisfaction now tempered by visible unease at the destruction and injury the previous night's battle had caused. Destruction that everyone in the room understood, whether they said it aloud or not, had been set into motion by her own reckless revelation. 20 guards wounded, Damien said, his voice carrying cold, controlled fury through the chamber. 3 dead, defending this castle against an organized assault that came directly as a result of information revealed carelessly and deliberately within this very council chamber 2 nights ago. His gaze settled on Seraphine with an intensity that made her flinch, despite her best efforts to maintain composure. "I trust everyone here understands exactly what price was paid for that particular piece of political maneuvering." "Your Majesty," Elder Edmund said carefully, "no one anticipated such a swift and violent response." Lady Seraphine's concerns regarding security, however poorly timed their delivery, were not entirely without merit. Her concerns, Damien said sharply, were entirely self-serving, born of jealousy, rather than genuine care for this pack's safety. And they cost the lives of 3 loyal guards who deserved far better than to die because of someone's wounded pride. He let the accusation settle over the room before continuing, his voice hardening further. "Regardless of the circumstances that led us here, we now face a choice. Elena Voss is the last surviving heir of the Emberfall bloodline, a bloodline our enemies have spent 20 years attempting to fully erase. We can continue debating whether her presence endangers this pack, or we can acknowledge the truth plainly. Abandoning her to those enemies would not make Blackthorn safer. It would simply make us complicit in finishing a genocide that should have ended 20 years ago." The chamber fell into heavy, uncomfortable silence, elders exchanging uneasy glances as the weight of Damien's words settled over the assembly. Queen Isolde rose slowly from her seat beside her son, her expression carrying a gravity that immediately drew the full attention of the room. "There is something more you all deserve to know," Isolde said quietly, "about the night Emberfall was destroyed, and about my own role in the tragedy that unfolded." Damien turned to his mother with visible surprise, having never heard her speak openly of these events, even in their most private conversations. Isolde met his gaze briefly, something like relief, mixing with old grief in her expression, before she continued addressing the assembled council. 20 years ago, I served as an envoy between Blackthorn and Emberfall, tasked with strengthening the alliance between our two packs, during a period of growing tension with certain hostile territories to the north. I had grown close, during my time there, with Emberfall's alpha and his mate, close enough that I stood as guardian to their infant daughter, born only months before the massacre that destroyed everything her family had built. Elena, who had been permitted to attend the session at Isolde's insistence despite the elders' initial objections, felt her breath catch, understanding immediately the direction of Isolde's confession before the words fully arrived. The night the attack came, I was away from the main village, meeting with border scouts regarding suspicious movement along Emberfall's northern edge, Isolde continued, her voice trembling now despite her obvious effort to maintain composure. By the time I returned, the entire village was engulfed in flame. I searched desperately for any survivors, for the child I had sworn to protect, and found nothing but devastation and loss so complete, I believed, for 20 years, that not a single soul had survived that terrible night. "You believed wrong," Damien said quietly, understanding now settling fully into place. "I believed wrong," Isolde agreed, tears finally breaking free despite her efforts to hold them back. "I have carried the guilt of that failure for 2 decades, believing I had failed the child I swore to protect, as thoroughly as I failed her parents, who considered me family, in every sense that mattered. When I recognized Elena's scar, when I understood who she truly was, I could not simply tell her the truth and walk away from the responsibility I had carried for 20 years without action. I owed her protection then. I owe her protection now, regardless of what political convenience might suggest otherwise." The chamber remained silent for a long moment, the weight of Isolde's confession settling over elders who had known her for decades, without ever suspecting the depth of guilt and grief she had carried quietly beneath her composed exterior. Elder Edmund, whose earlier skepticism had carried genuine concern for the pack's safety rather than malicious intent, finally broke the silence with a slow, thoughtful nod. "If what you say is true, Your Majesty," he said, addressing Isolde directly, "then this is no longer simply a matter of protecting a servant girl who happened to catch our king's attention. This is a matter of honor, of righting a wrong this pack inadvertently contributed to, through our alliance's failure to protect Emberfall 20 years ago. I, for one, cannot in good conscience vote to abandon her now." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber, the earlier tension shifting gradually toward something closer to protective resolve, though not every elder appeared fully convinced. Seraphine, sensing the tide turning firmly against her earlier maneuvering, rose from her seat, with visible effort to salvage some remaining shred of her position. "Your Majesty," she said, addressing Damien directly, her voice carrying a note of desperate calculation, "whatever sympathy this revelation deserves, the practical danger remains unchanged. As long as Elena remains within these walls, this pack faces continued attack from an enemy clearly willing to risk open assault to eliminate her. Perhaps the most protective course of action, both for Elena and for Blackthorn, would be relocating her somewhere our enemies cannot easily locate, rather than keeping her here as a continued target for further violence." It was, Damien recognized immediately, a final attempt at manipulation dressed in the language of concern, an effort to remove Elena from the castle, and from his own presence, under the guise of protective wisdom. He met Seraphine's gaze with cold, unwavering resolve. "Elena remains at Blackthorn," he said firmly, leaving no room for further debate. "Under my personal protection, and under the protection of every guard within these walls. We will not solve the danger she faces by abandoning her to face it alone. We will solve it by finding and eliminating the alliance responsible for hunting her, and by ensuring Blackthorn's defenses remain strong enough to withstand whatever further attacks they attempt." He turned to address the full council, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a king who had finally fully committed to a path he would not be swayed from, regardless of political pressure. I want every available resource directed toward identifying the leadership of this alliance. I want our defenses reinforced along every border, not simply the Western approach, and I want it made clear, to every member of this court and to any enemy watching from beyond our walls, that anyone who threatens Elena Voss threatens Blackthorn Pact directly, with all the consequences that declaration carries. The council session ended with the matter formally settled, though the tension in the chamber remained palpable as elders departed to spread word of the king's decision throughout the wider court. Seraphine left in silence, her earlier calculated triumph replaced by the bitter understanding that her scheme, rather than securing her own position, had instead pushed Damien further toward the very woman she had hoped to eliminate as a rival. Elena remained behind after the chamber emptied, finding Isolde still seated near the front, visibly drained by the emotional weight of her public confession. Elena crossed the room and knelt beside her, taking the older woman's hands in her own with the same gentleness Isolde had shown her weeks earlier. "Thank you," Elena said softly, "for telling them the truth, even though it cost you something to say it aloud. You are not simply a burden I inherited through guilt, Elena," Isolde said, meeting her eyes with fierce, unwavering warmth. "You have become someone I care for deeply, someone I am proud to call family, in every sense that matters, regardless of blood or circumstance. Whatever comes next, know that you do not face it alone, not anymore." Elena's eyes filled with grateful tears, and for the first time since learning the impossible truth of her heritage, she allowed herself to feel something closer to hope than fear. Hope that whatever battles still lay ahead, she would not have to face them without the support of people who had come, against every unlikely circumstance, to genuinely love and protect her. 3 weeks passed in careful, watchful preparation. Blackthorn's defenses grew stronger under Nathaniel's relentless training. New patrols established along every border, scouts positioned further into the surrounding territories to provide early warning of any further approach. Elena continued her training with Isolde, her control over her fire-touched gift growing steadily more confident with each passing session. The fragile ember she had once struggled to summon, now answering her call with growing ease and precision. Her relationship with Damien, no longer hidden or constrained by the need for secrecy, had deepened into something neither of them tried any longer to deny. He sought her company openly now, walking with her through the gardens each evening, sharing meals together when his duties allowed. The careful distance he had once maintained between king and servant entirely dissolved into genuine partnership and growing love. "The elders have begun asking again about the mate ceremony," Damien told her one evening, as they walked together beneath the old oak tree that had become, over the past weeks, something of a private refuge for them both. "They wish to know my intentions, now that Seraphine's claim has been thoroughly, publicly abandoned." Elena's chest tightened with a mixture of hope and lingering uncertainty. "And what have you told them?" Damien stopped walking, turning to face her directly, his dark eyes carrying an openness and vulnerability she had come to treasure over the weeks of their growing connection. "I told them I intend to choose the woman I have already fallen in love with, regardless of what bloodline or rank she carried when I first noticed her in that burning corridor. Whether she is a lost princess of Emberfall, or simply the servant girl who once hummed while polishing my banquet table, my choice remains exactly the same." Elena's breath caught, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes. "Damien, I am not asking you to answer tonight," he said gently, reaching up to brush a stray tear from her cheek. "I only wanted you to know where my heart stands, clearly and without any remaining doubt, before whatever comes next, in the danger we still face together." Whatever response Elena might have offered was interrupted by a sudden, urgent commotion echoing from the castle's main courtyard, guards shouting warnings that carried unmistakable alarm through the quiet evening air. Damien's expression shifted immediately into Commander's focus, and together they ran toward the source of the disturbance, arriving to find Nathaniel already directing a chaotic scene of guards scrambling to secure the castle's main gate. "Report," Damien demanded. A single rider approached under a white flag. "Your Majesty," Nathaniel said grimly, gesturing toward a figure standing just beyond the gate, flanked by 2 silent guards who had intercepted his approach. "He claims to represent the alliance responsible for the recent attacks, and insists on speaking directly with you and with Elena Voss both." Damien's jaw tightened, suspicion warring with cautious curiosity. Bring him to the main hall. Full guard, no exceptions. The messenger, a lean, sharp-eyed man who introduced himself only as Castellan's envoy, stood before the assembled court with unsettling calm, despite being surrounded by armed Blackthorn guards. His gaze found Elena immediately, studying her with cold, calculating interest that made her skin crawl with instinctive unease. Lord Castellan sends his regards, the envoy began, his voice carrying an oily formality that immediately set Damien's teeth on edge. He wishes to propose a resolution to the current conflict, one that would end further bloodshed on both sides. State your proposal, Damien said curtly. Surrender the Emberfall heir to Lord Castellan's custody, and all further hostility toward Blackthorn Pack will cease immediately, the envoy said, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. Lord Castellan has no quarrel with your pack directly, Your Majesty. His concern lies solely with ensuring the complete and final end of a bloodline that once posed significant threat to the stability of the Northern Territories. Hand her over, and your people will know peace. The chamber erupted into furious murmuring, and Damien felt rage building hot and immediate in his chest, though he forced himself to maintain the cold composure necessary for what he suspected might be a delicate, dangerous negotiation. And if I refuse? He asked. The envoy's expression did not change. Then Lord Castellan will have no choice but to consider Blackthorn an active enemy in this conflict, and will bring the full weight of his alliance against your walls until the matter is resolved, one way or another. He offers this chance at peace as a courtesy, Your Majesty, given the respect his alliance has traditionally held for Blackthorn territory. I would encourage careful consideration before rejecting it outright. Damien's gaze flicked briefly to Elena, standing tense and pale beside him, her hands curled into fists at her sides. The flame warmth he knew simmered beneath her calm exterior, clearly straining against the effort of restraint. When he spoke again, his voice carried absolute, unwavering certainty. Tell your Lord Castellan that Blackthorn Pack does not surrender its people to enemies, regardless of the threats offered in exchange. Elena Voss is under my personal protection, and will remain so for as long as I draw breath. If Castellan wishes to bring war to my walls over a 20-year-old grudge against a pack he already believes destroyed, then he will find Blackthorn far better prepared to answer that threat than he apparently anticipates. The envoy's expression finally shifted, something like genuine surprise flickering behind his cold composure, before he recovered his formal bearing. As you wish, Your Majesty. I will deliver your answer to Lord Castellan directly. He departed under the same white flag that had granted him entry, and the chamber fell into tense, uneasy silence once he had gone, the full weight of Damien's declaration settling over everyone present. War, open and undeniable, now loomed over Blackthorn Pack, a war that would test every defense they had spent the past 3 weeks building, and one that carried consequences far beyond the fate of a single young woman, however precious she had become to the king, who had just publicly staked his entire kingdom's safety on her protection. That night, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion weighing on her, Elena found Damien standing alone on the castle's highest tower, staring out at the dark tree line where enemies now gathered, preparing for an assault everyone understood was no longer a matter of if, but when. You risked everything tonight, she said quietly, joining him at the tower's edge. Your entire pack's safety, staked on refusing to hand me over. I would not have chosen differently, Damien said, without hesitation. Not for anything, Elena, not even to spare Blackthorn from war. Why? She asked, though she suspected, deep in her heart, that she already knew his answer. Because loving you, Damien said, turning to face her fully, his dark eyes carrying an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs, is not a choice I made carelessly, nor one I am willing to abandon simply because it demands sacrifice. You are worth defending, Elena, not because of the bloodline you carry, but because of who you are, the woman who ran into fire to save a stranger's child, who spoke truth even when no one believed her, who has faced impossible circumstances with more courage than I have witnessed from warriors twice your training. Whatever war comes because of my choice tonight, I will fight it beside you, gladly, for as long as it takes to see you safe. Elena closed the remaining distance between them, and when Damien's arms wrapped around her, pulling her close against the cold night air, she felt, for the first time since learning the impossible truth of her heritage, entirely, completely certain that whatever battles still lay ahead, She would face them not as a hunted, hidden survivor, but as a woman fully known and fully loved, standing beside a king who had chosen her, without hesitation, above every political convenience his crown might otherwise have demanded. The attack, when it finally came 3 days later, arrived not with the careful stealth of the previous assaults, but with the open, overwhelming force of a genuine army, Lord Castellan's alliance descending upon Blackthorn's walls in numbers that dwarfed anything the pack had previously faced. Fire arrows arced across the night sky, guards scrambled to their defensive positions, and the full, terrible reality of the war Damien had chosen finally, undeniably arrived at their gates. Elena stood at Damien's side as the battle began, no longer hidden away in the safety of the keep, but positioned deliberately at the front lines, her fire-touched gift, now a weapon she wielded with confident, deliberate control, rather than desperate, uncertain instinct. Together, king and heir, warrior and flame-touched survivor, they faced the enemy that had haunted her entire forgotten life, prepared finally to end, once and for all, the threat that had shadowed her existence since the night a burning village had first taken everything she had ever known. The battle raged through the night with a ferocity that tested every ounce of preparation Blackthorn had gathered over the preceding weeks. Nathaniel commanded the eastern line with disciplined precision, rallying guards who fought with the desperate determination of people defending their homes, rather than simply following orders. Damien moved through the chaos at the western breach, his swordwork lethal and controlled, cutting down enemy after enemy, with the focused efficiency of a king who had trained his entire life for exactly this kind of decisive, defining moment. Elena fought beside him, no longer the frightened servant girl who had once trembled at the memory of flame surging uncontrolled through her hands. She moved through the battlefield with growing confidence, calling fire in careful, deliberate bursts that scattered enemy formations without endangering her own allies, her amber eyes blazing bright in the darkness, as the ancient gift of her bloodline finally found its true, intended purpose, after 20 years of forced dormancy. It was near the height of the battle, as Blackthorn's defenses began, slowly and painfully, to push the invading force back toward the tree line, that Lord Castellan himself finally appeared, stepping from the shadows of the forest with an entourage of his most elite fighters, his cold, pale eyes fixing immediately on Elena across the chaos of the battlefield. He was an older man, silver-haired and sharp-featured, carrying himself with the rigid, calculated bearing of someone who had spent decades planning and executing violence with methodical, unfeeling precision. Elena felt an old, instinctive terror rise in her chest the moment his gaze found her, some deep, buried memory recognizing him even though her conscious mind had never before seen his face. "You," Castellan said, his voice carrying clearly across the momentary lull in fighting, as both sides recognized the significance of his arrival. "Little Flame, I remember your mother's screams when I finally understood a child had somehow slipped free of the flames I set that night. 20 years, and here you stand, exactly as troublesome alive as I always feared you might become." The words struck Elena with the force of a physical blow, confirmation, finally and completely, of the voice from her recurring dream, the man responsible for the fire that had stolen her entire family and her earliest memories in a single, devastating night. Grief and fury rose together in her chest, and the warmth beneath her ribs surged into something far more powerful than she had ever previously summoned, fire building in her hands until the very air around her seemed to shimmer with heat. "You murdered my family," she said, her voice carrying a steadiness that surprised even herself, the terror she expected to feel, replaced instead by cold, clarifying purpose. "You destroyed an entire pack because you feared what we represented. Tonight, that fear ends, one way or another." Castellan's expression carried the faintest hint of surprise, quickly smoothed back into cold, contemptuous confidence. A single untrained girl, however powerful her bloodline, poses little true threat to an alliance that has spent 20 years perfecting exactly how to counter Emberfall's gift. "Surrender now, and I may yet consider sparing this pack that so foolishly chose to shelter you." "She is not alone," Damien said, stepping forward to stand beside Elena with unwavering resolve, his sword still bloodied from the battle raging around them. "And Blackthorn does not surrender its people, regardless of the threats offered against them." Castellan's gaze shifted between them, understanding settling into his cold expression as he recognized the depth of the alliance he now faced. Not simply a frightened survivor hiding behind borrowed protection, but a king who had staked his entire kingdom on her defense, and a woman who had finally, fully embraced the power and purpose of the bloodline she carried. "Then we finish this tonight," Castellan said, drawing a curved blade from beneath his cloak, signaling his elite guard forward with a sharp gesture. What followed was the fiercest fighting of the entire battle, Castellan's elite fighters proving far more skilled than the disciplined but ordinary soldiers who had comprised the bulk of his earlier assault. Damien fought at Elena's side with fierce, protective intensity, his sword meeting Castellan's own blade in a series of brutal exchanges that tested every hour of training he had ever endured, while Elena called flame in defense of them both, her control now precise enough to shield without harming, to strike without hesitation. The turning point came when Castellan, growing frustrated with his failure to break through Damien's defense, shifted his focus directly toward Elena, his blade cutting toward her with lethal, calculated speed. Damien moved to intercept, but the distance proved too great, and for one terrible suspended heartbeat, it seemed certain that the blade would find its mark. Elena's instincts, honed now through weeks of careful training and the desperate urgency of the moment, responded before conscious thought could catch up. Fire erupted from her outstretched hands, with an intensity she had never before summoned, not the careful, controlled bursts of her recent training, but the full, unrestrained power of a bloodline finally, completely awakened after 20 years of dormant waiting. The flame caught Castellan directly, and his triumphant advance collapsed into a stumbling retreat, his blade falling from suddenly weakened fingers as the fire drove him back with overwhelming force. He did not rise again from where he finally fell, and the remaining fighters of his elite guard, witnessing their leader's sudden, decisive defeat, broke formation entirely, fleeing back into the forest in scattered disarray. Word spread quickly through the remaining invading force, and within the hour, what had begun as a coordinated, overwhelming assault dissolved into a chaotic retreat, Castellan's alliance abandoning the field entirely as dawn's first gray light began creeping over the eastern horizon. Blackthorn had won. Elena sank to her knees amid the aftermath, the surge of power that had finally defeated Castellan, leaving her utterly drained, her hands trembling as the amber glow faded slowly from her eyes. Damien was beside her instantly, gathering her carefully into his arms, checking for injury, with frantic, gentle hands, even as relief and exhaustion warred visibly across his own battle-worn features. "It's over," he murmured against her hair, his voice thick with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Elena, it's over. You did it. You ended 20 years of hunting in a single night." "We did it," she corrected softly, too exhausted to manage more than a whisper, though the words carried genuine, grateful warmth. "Together." Around them, the battlefield slowly quieted, as Blackthorn guards began the exhausted work of tending wounds and confirming the enemy's full retreat, the first true victory against Castellan's alliance in 20 years of shadowed, fearful uncertainty, finally, definitively achieved. Nathaniel arrived to report the battle's final toll, casualties significant, but far lighter than they might have been without Elena's decisive intervention, and word already spreading through the ranks of the remarkable, impossible flame that had finally driven their most dangerous enemy from the field entirely. News of the victory reached the castle proper within hours, and by midday, the entire pack had gathered in the main courtyard, exhausted but jubilant, celebrating a triumph that had seemed, only days earlier, far from certain. Queen Isolde stood among them, tears of relief and pride streaming freely down her face as she embraced Elena tightly. 20 years of guilt finally, fully released in the joy of this hard-won, decisive victory. "Your mother would be so proud of you," Isolde whispered, holding Elena close. "The daughter of Emberfall's Alpha, finally standing victorious against the very enemy that once destroyed everything her family built. You have honored her memory beyond anything I ever dared hope to witness." Elena, still weak from the battle's aftermath but steadier now, with rest and the safety of victory finally secured, allowed herself to weep openly, for the first time since learning the full truth of her heritage, grief and joy, mingling together in tears that felt, finally, like healing rather than simply loss. That evening, as the castle prepared a formal celebration to honor the victory, and the fallen alike, Damien requested a private audience with the full council, Elena standing beside him as he addressed the assembled elders with quiet, unwavering resolve. 20 years ago, this pact failed to prevent the destruction of an ally we had sworn to protect, he began, his voice carrying easily through the hushed chamber. Tonight, we have finally righted a portion of that failure, defeating the very enemy responsible for that ancient tragedy, and in doing so, discovering something I believe this pact has needed for far longer than any of us realized. He turned to look at Elena directly, his expression carrying open, unguarded devotion that needed no further words to explain his intention. I wish to formally declare my intention to take Elena Voss, rightful heir of Emberfall, as my mate and future Luna of Blackthorn Pack. The chamber erupted into enthusiastic approval, elders who had once hesitated over Elena's safety, now rising to offer their genuine, wholehearted support for a union that represented not simply a king's personal happiness, but the beginning of a new alliance between two bloodlines that had once been torn apart by tragedy, and were now, finally, being woven back together through love rather than loss. Elder Edmund, who had witnessed the entire journey from cautious skepticism to genuine respect, stepped forward with a rare, warm smile creasing his weathered features. Your Majesty, on behalf of this entire council, I can think of no union more fitting, nor any Luna more deserving of the honor. Blackthorn would be fortunate indeed to call the daughter of Emberfall its future queen. That night, beneath a sky finally clear of smoke and battle, Blackthorn Castle celebrated not only a hard-won victory, but the beginning of a new future, one built on truth rather than hidden secrets, on genuine partnership rather than political convenience. Elena stood at Damien's side throughout the celebration, no longer the invisible servant girl who had once polished tables without ever once catching her king's attention, but a woman fully known, fully loved, and finally, completely home among people who had come to cherish her for exactly who she truly was. Charlotte found her during a quiet moment amid the festivities, embracing her friend with tearful, delighted pride. I told you, she said, laughing through her tears. I told you he never once managed to look away from you, even before either of you understood why. Elena laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that carried none of the careful restraint she had once worn, like armor, throughout her years of quiet, invisible service. You did tell me. I should have listened sooner. Later, as the celebration wound down and the castle settled into peaceful, exhausted quiet, Elena found herself once more beneath the old oak tree in the garden, the pendant her mother had once worn resting warm and familiar against her chest, the flame-shaped scar on her shoulder no longer a mystery, but a proud, permanent reminder of the bloodline and the courage that had carried her through every impossible circumstance life had placed before her. Damien joined her there, settling beside her on the familiar stone bench, taking her hand in his with the same careful, gentle warmth he had shown from the very beginning of their unlikely, extraordinary journey together. From the girl the Alpha King once walked past without a single glance, he said softly, to the woman he could not imagine his future without. It has been quite a journey, Elena Voss, heir of Emberfall. It has, she agreed, resting her head against his shoulder as the stars emerged fully overhead, bright and steady against the clear night sky. And I would not trade a single difficult moment of it, not now, knowing where that journey has finally led us both. Beneath the old oak tree, as the last echoes of celebration faded into peaceful nighttime quiet, the Alpha King and the lost princess of Emberfall sat together in comfortable, grateful silence, their future, finally, securely their own, built not on secrets or fear, but on the hard-won truth of who they both truly were, and the genuine, unshakable love that had grown between them, despite every obstacle placed in its path. The war that had once threatened to consume everything was finally over, and in its place, something far more lasting had begun, a partnership between two bloodlines, two hearts, and two futures, woven together at last into something neither Elena nor Damien would ever again have to face alone.